Hi, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us on this webinar on a national level transit investment program. And we would like, so this work we have been doing is on how we can institute a investment program and how we can bring in national funding towards building bus-based public transportation system. And this work has been supported by Shakti Sustainable Energy Foundation. And this webinar is part of a project supported by Shakti and FedEx, and we would like to extend our thanks to them. So I will just give a brief on the housekeeping for this session. We will request all of you to keep typing in your questions in the chat box, and we will take questions at the end of each session. And the details on the sessions are attached in the agenda, which you can find in the hands out section of the tab on the right hand side of your screen. So if you have any difficulty in accessing any of this, keep messaging us in the chat box. We'll be able to give you control and and answer your questions. Thank you so much. So I'll hand it over to Amit.
Thanks a lot, Shilpa. Thanks a lot, Shilpa, and good afternoon, everyone. And I think some of the people have joined from other parts of the world. So good morning, good evening, wherever you are. I think this is a very interesting session. So this is our 16th Bus Karo session that we are organizing. And the first probably an online session, as many of you know would have participated in person in the last 15 Bus Karo sessions. This is an online session because of the ongoing COVID crisis. But seeing the level of participation, I'm thinking we should probably consider an online version going forward as well. Because we have typically seen about 100 odd people participating, but for this we got about 969 registrations already, and then we expect a much larger turnout. So before going into further details on what we will be talking and what we'll be deliberating, I would first invite the partner, my partner in crime, Vivek Chandran from Shakti. Shakti has been supporting Bus Karo for a very long time, and this topic of looking at national support for buses is very timely. So maybe I'll first ask Vivek to highlight some of the key issues that he is seeing on the bus front, and then we will go slightly deeper in detail on what we are going to expect today. So over to you, Vivek.
Thank you, Amit. It's fascinating to see you, by the way. The new look is really interesting. So, hi everyone. Good afternoon, and of course, hope you're all well and safe in these really times. So what I will do is try and give you an idea of what we do, as well as give you some context to Bus Karo and what we're attempting here. So I'm Vivek Chandran. I lead the transport and the electric mobility program at Shakti. For those of you who may be new to Shakti, just a brief idea is that basically we are a regranting organization that seeks to facilitate a clean energy transition for India. And we do that by aiding the design and implementation of policies that promote clean power, energy efficiency, sustainable transport, and climate action. So in this case, what we do is we work with collaboratively with policymakers and civil society such as WRI, think tanks, industry, to essentially come down to addressing those transformative solutions that can get us where we want to be in terms of a clean and sustainable future. So like Amit said, we've been supporting that might be a lot of noise. So we've been supporting Bus Karo for a while now, and in earlier iterations, the agenda has been to essentially find out what may be those interventions that that we can look at to further bus-based public transport in India, to make it more sustainable and make it more easily available to everyone, that being one of the biggest barriers that we face. And this year we reached this very interesting time where we just reached that point where we're a decade from JNNURM, And there a grim scenario started facing us that all those buses that we bought 10 years ago, they seem to still be a large percentage of the fleet of STUs. And without a new impetus to purchase buses, we may be looking at a situation where our STUs fleets begin to decline. And that was the reason why we started looking at the need for a larger national level push, considering the fact that maybe state level initiatives have not been sufficient in this case. We can't say that for every state, but predominantly that being the case. And it is in that line that you will see this work as well and this conversation. And I think I would look forward to this discussion to throw more light on how we can go forward. There have been several initiatives recently that are very promising and that can be quite instrumental in giving us what we need in terms of sustainability on public transport. But predominantly, we're also looking at it from a two-pronged approach. One being something, an initiative that is quick, that does not let the fleets decline going forward in the next few years, and at the same time, something that is transformative, that is reformative. We don't reach this point again 10 years from now. And so some of the reasons that are underlining these problems can get solved in a systemic manner. So having said that, I think over to Amit, and I look forward to the discussion and hope you all enjoy it and have learnings from it that you can take back to your own work. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Vivek. I think, yes, almost 10 years of where we started from JNURM and now kind of looking back, how do we take the agenda forward? So then let me just quickly share my screen and I'll give you a quick background to the overall context of what we are doing or what we will be kind of talking today, and then we can basically start the session. So let me just quickly share the screen and then I'll switch off my video and then we can start the session. So what we are trying to do is to see how we can help accelerate the public transport deployment in our cities, and that's something which we will be talking today in this 3.5 hour session. So first thing first, why are we really talking about buses? And that's a fundamental question to ask. So if you look at the way things are, if you look at the mobility pattern in our cities, if you look at how things, how kind of the transportation happen in our cities, we are really looking at a large amount of, so almost 85% of our transport is road based, and within that almost 85% of what happens actually or what moves is through cities. So this is something which is very important, and so if you look at this from the overall mobility perspective, we are looking at basically from that we have to concentrate on moving on looking at how do we make buses as an overall part of our mobility mix. The other thing which is also interesting is to look at, if we see how transport has grown, transport has really kind of is growing almost 3 to 4 times in last couple of decades, and going forward the sector is only to grow further. Now, what is really interesting is that if you look at the overall vehicle population, I think almost 87% of the population of the vehicles is personal vehicle, and buses are less than a percent. So almost 7.74% of the overall fleet is buses, and that too when they carry about 85% of the demand. So we know what happens because of this huge externalities. Now, whether it is greenhouse gas emission, air pollution, fuel consumption, road safety, road traffic crashes, or even congestion. And then we know how these impact our cities. But that's not the problem. The problem is that if you look at the projections between 2011 and 2031, the passenger travel demand is expected to grow almost 16 times. Now, if the current situation is a problem, then the future is going to be even worse unless we do something about it. And that's why we have to look at buses as an integral part of our mobility. Now, as a background, so largely we are seeing buses in two categories of operation: publicly owned and operated like STUs and some of the SPVs, which are publicly held, or we have private owned buses. And within that, you have kind of very kind of operation, right from employee transport, school buses, or even privately operated buses. Now, almost we have seen there are about 17-18 lakh buses which are registered in India till date, and we still don't know how much of it is under operation, but my guess is somewhere about 16 odd lakh buses still operate. And if you look at the overall split, then publicly held buses are less than 10%, and 90% are privately held buses. And then there is a whole issue of whether they are legal or illegal, or whether they are permit violations or not. And then there's a huge fleet which doesn't have a valid permit. But I think even in the publicly held buses, you see, I think the number has not really significantly been added in last many years. And that is one of the big problems that we are seeing in cities. There is a kind of stagnation in growth. Yes, a lot of impetus came through JNURM, where about 21,000 buses were added. But since then, we have not seen any significant national level initiative to support buses. Now, currently, we have about something like 10 buses per lakh population. And then we look at the industry average of around somewhere between 40 to 60 buses per lakh population. So that's 4 to 6 times the growth that needs to happen even at a base year. And if you project, then the number will anyways be much higher. Now, within that 10 buses per lakh population, there is also huge variation within states. So a union territory like Chandigarh has about 54 buses per lakh population, to a state like Bihar, which has less than 1 bus per lakh population. So there is a huge variation within the country, even though the low base of 10 buses per lakh population. And the same you can say is also with STUs, and a lot of STUs actually have buses which are pretty old in nature. And so how do we kind of revitalize, recatalyze it is something to be looked at. Now, we have about 7,935 urban settlements, 468 class 1 towns, 53 million plus cities, and 9 mega cities. And if you look at how buses are split, mega cities take away the chunk of the buses, whereas a lot of cities which are less than 1 million, we don't know how many buses are under operation. So within that also there's a huge skew towards bigger city getting more amount of buses. Again, with urban bus, the number is fairly low. So we anticipate anywhere between 30 to 40,000, or in fact 36,000 is the fleet which is under operation in the urban environment, and a lot of it has come because of the JNURM, and thanks to that, a lot of cities now have a formal bus system. But again, as I said, there is a huge deficit in terms of the number of buses that we need. Now, one of the big reasons why we have not seen the rapid increase in buses, and amongst many things, is the whole issue of cost recovery. And STUs typically recover almost 2/3 of their cost. But when you look at the urban operation, the cost recovery is less than 50%. And that becomes a big issue. And there are issues other like operational efficiency, safety, security, private mode growth and all. But the crux of the matter of why public transport has not grown is the lack of cost recovery in the urban environment specifically. So as we look at going forward, 2031, what needs to be done? And these are some of the initial estimates which were made, that yes, we need about 2 lakh more buses that is required for next 10 years. We also need almost 2,500 depots and close to 1,200 terminals. We need 3,000 crore kilometer of bus operation that needs to be performed. So then how do you make sure these are fuel efficient buses, clean buses is something that has to be looked at. We need infrastructure that will digital infrastructure that can support these operations, and a huge technical capacity needs to be done if we have to move to this scenario. And so there's some ballpark estimate that almost looking at 2,33,000 crores worth of investment that would be required if we have to move to this direction. And again, if that, our problems are also further confined because of the ongoing COVID crisis, and where we have seen a huge drop in passenger revenue. So the low and the no ridership has really resulted in a massive disruption for bus operation in India. So as we look at a national level program, the question then becomes, how do we create that vision? How do we create an institutional arrangement? And how do you create a program that effectively delivers on this front? It delivers on fleet, it delivers on support infrastructure, it helps operation, it helps in traffic control, intelligent transportation systems, and builds technical capacity. And so who will do what is also very important. What role will national government play? What can states do? What do STUs and SPVs do? And last but not the least, what can private sector do to reform the bus agenda? So with this, I think we'll end this introductory session as a background session. For the next session, we will hand it over to Dr. O.P. Agarwal, who will take the next session forward. So over to you, O.P. sir.
Thanks, Amit. Thanks very much and welcome everyone. It's very nice to see almost 400 of you participating in this. Hopefully the numbers will increase a little more as we go along, but really a pleasure, and thank you for joining. I think that was a very interesting opening session that Amit laid out. The agenda, the the background to where we stand on bus systems. So I think that was a very interesting one where he gave a lot of data on where we stand with buses, what we need in terms of buses. So let me not dwell on that. But let me, in very simple terms, say that buses were and continue to remain the mainstay of the mobility system across the country. Is both in intra-city movement as well as in intercity movement. They are the mainstay of our transport system and our mobility system. What seems to have changed over the years is the kind of attention that they have been getting. I think that is a little unfortunate because despite being the mainstay, the attention has moved elsewhere, and this is what needs to be corrected. I remember somewhere in the mid-1990s, the government of India, through the then Ministry of Transport, as it was called, continued to provide financial support from the national government to the state transport undertakings, the STUs. But somewhere around the mid-1990s, they decided that the national government would no longer provide support, and they asked the state government to take this over. I was around that time the Secretary for Transport in Assam, and I remember how this caused so much of a problem to the states, which were totally unprepared to be able to support their STUs. So this was one move away from bus systems. Coming to 2008, that's more recent compared to the mid-1990s, the Government of India, through the Ministry of Urban Development this time, decided to provide support to the state governments on intra-city buses. That means city bus services. Some of the prime drivers of why this program was launched were two or three things. One is, for those who may recall, 2008 was the year when we went through a major recession, and the auto industry was not getting an offtake from its inventory on the yards, and that was one opportunity to look at, can we get an offtake of buses from the auto industry to help them sort of improve their liquidity. So that was one prime driver of the JNNURM bus funding scheme that was launched. But there were two other things that were added to it as the ministry went along. One was that out of 88 cities that had a population of more than 500,000 people, only 20 had a bus service. Only 20 of them had a structured public bus service. And one of the ideas in the ministry was that, can we use this funding as a way to introduce bus services in some of these cities which don't have a bus service? So one objective was introduce new bus services in cities that did not have one. The second objective was, can we use this as an opportunity to improve the quality of bus services, both improve the buses and improve the quality of the services. So a number of conditions that were laid out in that funding scheme required buses of a certain type to be bought so that they were to be introduced in cities, and hopefully with the improved quality of service, more people would start using it, and going forward, the bus operators would be able to provide additional buses. This was broadly the thinking when the JNNURM bus funding scheme was introduced. Obviously, as it got rolled out, a number of problems were seen. Some of the problems were that in terms of cities which didn't have a bus service, they did not even have the capacity for managing these bus services. So that lack of capacity was a huge problem. I've seen some of the cities where they did not have a depot, they were parking buses under the flyover, and all kinds of things of that sort happened, which was not very good. So a number of the buses which really have been working and working well have been cities where they had STUs and had the infrastructure and the capacity to run buses. But then that scheme ended, and after that, nothing has been introduced again. As Amit very rightly pointed out, the number of buses that we have in cities has been woefully short of what a norm requires. Studies that have been done around the world by the World Bank really show that something like 40 to 60 buses per lakh population is the right number. Of course, this is contingent on what are the other forms of public transport that are available, but broadly a number of 40 to 60 is what is the expectation. But our buses are far short of that. Again, Amit pointed out, less than 1% are buses, and a much smaller number out of that are public bus services. So that is something that really needs to be scaled up. And how is that to be done? That's, to my mind, COVID really provides an opportunity for us to step back and think. This is the time where we need to be looking at new mobility situations where levels of demand may come down because of an emphasis on working from home. Levels of demand will certainly come down for some period of time because of the compulsions of social distancing. And in this situation, what is it that we can think of for buses going forward? How do we think in terms of their investments? How do we think in terms of their operational parameters? How do we think in terms of their governance? I think a lot of these will really be part of the later session that we have during the day. But I thought at this session, let me just lay out a little background to two previous examples of how Government of India has been funding buses, and also leave it to my other co-panelists on this to speak about their experience, and then we can move on to the session. So at this point, let me stop at this and invite Mr. Ramamurthy and Janki. I don't know if Janki has been able to join the session, so maybe we can start with Mr. Ramamurthy for his inputs, and then have a little discussion, some questions that may come up at the end of this session before moving to the next one. So much from me for now. Mr. Ramamurthy, over to you.
So can you please unmute your phone?
Yeah.
Sir, we can't hear you. Can you please unmute?
Good afternoon, Agarwal sir, and then thanks to WRI and then Shakti. And then it's a good presentation by Amit, and it's very comprehensive. And then Agarwal sir, being an expert in this, I think has given good hints or the experience about the NARM buses we have used. I would like to share some points about the usage of the NARM buses and other things. I'll just this funding. There were some points which were given, which I wanted to cover about the old things. This funding of basically the NERM was on like a capital expenditure for the rolling stocks, which we had ranging from 50-50 to for some of the cities to 80-20 for the tier 2 cities. And then the NERM buses actually helped us all the STUs to connect the villages, and then the STUs provided city transport to tier 2 cities. I'm just sharing my KSRTC's experience of providing the facilities to this suburb also, and again Mysore city we operate, and also the lot of tier 2 cities like Kolar, Tumkur and other cities we operate. And then it was really a great experience, and then a lot of vehicles were given, and then we have inducted large number of NERM buses into the tier 2 cities, which has helped to improve the development activities at the tier 2 cities. And then this has also helped for operating these new buses to the industrial areas, wherein we were able to give new buses. We have connected even the villages to the industrial areas using these NERM buses. The only issue was that the NERM buses, because of the long 244 wheelbase and then a longer chassis and all, this cost of operation was on a higher side. And as the especially in our state and some of the states, as the operational cost was not like the viability gap funding was not supported, the funding was happened only for the rolling stock. So this has helped to procure the buses, but operational cost was on a higher side. And then the suburban services and also the obligatory services like operating to the suburb services and also connecting the villages was not a highly earning route for us, and then a potential route. We still operated all these buses to improve the services. By and large, lot of villages connected to the cities, and then a lot of economic growth happened, and then they were all happy. Because of the new buses we have introduced, most of them were happy, but the STUs started losing heavily on this. And as a small, I mean to say, we operate about more than 400 to 450 buses, which we started losing almost about 70 to 80 crores a year, every year to year. But it has helped the society to improve. And then coming to different points, it was the beginning of the ITS systems and all installed, and we were not able to. It was in a learning process for all the STUs. In most of the STUs, as I heard with my friends and all, this ITS systems they were not able to implement in total. So it was just to the extended. It was really up to the facility of announcing the next bus stops and other things. In most of the cities, this PIS boards of next ETAs and then the management tools for this using extended totally ITS facilities, that didn't happen. But we were able to do it only in Mysore because of the good rather a system integrator and also our involvement of organizations in the ITS. Only in Mysore city we were able to implement. We had about 100 NERM buses out of 435 buses, but we were able to implement, including the NERM buses, all the city buses we were able to implement the ITS, wherein the public have highly appreciated, and then they have started using it. Even our operations were very well improved, and then we were able to improve operational efficiency to a very great extent. We were able to maintain the departures times of 98% adherence, and we were able to get some good reports of trip missed and all those things in Mysore. But that may not be the case. That is not the case even with our own other cities like Tumkur, Kolar, and other things. I think other cities also, other STUs also had the same problem, sir. And then the ridership, coming to this, the transport facility, the ridership had improved from at least 5 to 6. ITS in Mysore, it has improved by 5 to 10%. But even in other cities also, the ridership has improved because of the good buses and then good facilities. And then the safety was ensured for the villagers and also the industrial workers. That was a big change that we have seen. But as seen in one of the, I heard that we were able to get the information that some of the state governments are extending the VGF funding to a very great extent, especially in Gujarat and other places wherein they were getting up to 20-25 rupees per kilometer. But we in some of the states like Karnataka also were not able to get the VGF funding. But so this was, even though it has become like a compulsion for us to operate the city services, once it becomes obligatory, we should stick on to that. And then it was being very useful with other political forces, and then also as an obligation, and then really service to the public. We kept on operating, and then till today we also operate before the this COVID lockdown. And then STUs, sir, one thing is, STUs are any day ready to operate the public transport very efficiently, and then also we are always there to the service of the public, for the service to the public. But only thing is, when the government organizations or the government, the Department of Transport, or the state government, or the funding from the central government helps us a lot to improve our services, and then without thinking anything else, I mean to say, have a second thought, will definitely support the government to improve the economy by operating more buses even for suburb. Whereas only our intercity services are fetching us good operational cost and also a little marginal money, and even AC buses and all, we are getting some good margin. Whereas these buses, we have, it has become like we are offsetting all our losses from other services we operate. So that's the rather the requirement of all the STUs. I think so, sir. That's what I suggest. The requirement is, sir. I think, I hope all the audience are also members from STUs accept this as a whole. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Ramamurthy. Very, very interesting. In fact, I must add that KSRTC is the one example, I think the only example in the country, where they have taken the trouble of going and working with tier 2 cities to develop independent city bus services for them. And that is how some of these cities in Karnataka were able to get the capacity to design and put together bus services. Most of the other states, this did not happen. In a few states that I don't want to name, the STU decided to operate all the services on its own. They ran, it was not the same as designing a bus service for a city in consultation with that city. I think that is the one unique thing that KSRTC has done. And I think that's also part of the reason why there are many awards that KSRTC got primarily for this purpose. So that I think is kudos to KSRTC. I think the other point is also absolutely right, that it was a stage where ITS was, it was a learning stage for most people on what ITS is and how it is to operate. I think it was also a stage where a kind of a watershed, in the sense that people began to realize that quality of bus service is important to attract people, because people had other options and they were moving to the other options. So it's time where you needed to start getting people to come on to buses. You had to work hard towards making them attractive. Just operating buses on its own would not be enough. It needed more. This was really that stage where this JNNURM scheme came in. Now, I don't see Janaki having joined. I don't know what is the situation. She hasn't joined.
One more issue I'd like to share with you.
Yeah.
maybe it will happen, the session will happen after this. But because of this capacity, I think maybe will be coming for this reduction in capacity and other things. There is going to be a very big change in the public transport that's going to happen. One thing is, now this migration workers, sir, we have struggled a lot, and then we have actually in fact shifted about 1 lakh migrants inside the state itself, because the northern Karnataka being the very economically weaker sections, a lot of people had come here, a lot of workers had come to south part of, I mean to say, like Bangalore, Mangalore and all. Even from Bangalore, even there are more than 3 lakh migrants who are eagerly waiting to be shifted to other states. This 1 lakh within the state, because of our internal permissions and other things, we were able to shift. But now the greatest challenge now,
I have joined and there is someone speaking.
the trains are also they're operating and then arranging. There is a big demand for our buses also to shift. But only thing is, because of this capacity utilization of 30 load, we are facing a very high cost crisis also. I mean to say, our cost doesn't work out, but the workers are not able to pay. We have serious issues on this. Somehow we are managing to convince, the government is trying to convince them not to go because they want to start the economic activity. All those things are happening, but we are also trying to play a good role by doing some kind of a service, even though it is not viable, economically viable. We are trying to help them. But even after the lockdown eases out also, I think the small transport, like they may not be able, a lot of public operators, I mean to say that buses and all private operators, they have cancelled their permits for not able to pay the renewal fees and all those things. I think STUs will have to take a big responsibility in the days to come, sir. I think the government has to support for this with low revenue realization. That's all.
Absolutely, completely agree with you on that. So Janki has joined. Janki, welcome to you. Very nice to see you on this.
Madam, good evening. Nice to see you.
So do you want to come in now? What we were talking about is a little background to the previous support that bus operating companies and STUs used to get from the government of India. In my thing, I spoke a little bit about what used to happen in the mid-1990s from the Ministry of Road Transport, and then about the JNNURM bus funding that came in 2008. I gave a little bit of a background on that, and I would say this is the right time for you to come in with your thoughts.
Right, sir. Right, sir.
Over to you.
Thank you, sir. Sorry, I've been a little late. Am I audible, sir?
Yes, you're audible. Yeah.
Okay. Our real push for the bus sector actually started with JNNURM. Before that, lot of cities didn't have an inkling of a formal bus transport services. So with JNNURM, actually the thrust came on the public transport and the bus-based public transport. So post JNNURM, we have been reviewing how it went and all that, but in spite of what we have been talking about, the positives and negatives, I feel at the end of the day, we have a lot of learnings from the JNNURM investments that happen in the buses. After JNNURM, we at the ministry have these two small World Bank funded projects, SUTP and ESCBS, which is again focused around a lot of other transport related infrastructure investments, including the buses. In JNNURM, around 65 cities procured buses, 25,000 plus buses. I could say there's a learning there of three categories. One, the cities which already had strong systems of running buses with good infrastructure and service systems. So they could capitalize this investment which came from the center as well, and then they moved further ahead. And then there were certain cities, like I could say the best example is Bhopal, which had no bus service prior to GNURM. They just started with GNURM, had their own models of running buses, and they are slowly evolving. So just from 10, 20 buses, they are just moving ahead now. And from owning the buses, they have moved into a good model of GCC also, Bhopal. And there are certain cities, and the third type, what I would like to stress upon is the third category of cities, like with our experience in SUTP and ESCBS also, like Jaipur, Mera Bhayandar, who had procured buses, but because of lack of the strength within their organization, and I should say also the lack of push from the respective state governments also in terms of financial handholdings. So they could not leverage much with this investment. And again, there are learnings from that also, which we are trying to build in now within the ministry. So with lot of metros happening now, the ministry also wanted to push for the other non-metro based transport services, which and the center point of which is buses, of course. So, and we hope this learning especially will help us to move the cities away from owning and operating with the buses to the GCC model of operating the buses, with small variance between cities also, depending on their how they decide about few other things and how well positioned their infrastructure is. So this is from my side, sir.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Janki. Very interesting. I think the whole idea, what is going to be encouraging to everyone who is on this, is when you talk about the ministry is thinking about bringing in some kind of a program of this nature. I think that is really good news. I hope that comes up soon. Now, with this, let me see if there are any questions. Is there on the chat box from anyone who would like to raise a question? Where do I see if there are? Okay, we have quite a few here.
Only one question.
One question, okay. So the question from Gerald, my dear friend Gerald, had to ask this question, and that has obviously for you, Janki. What is the timing of that? Let me not sort of embarrass Janki on this. I think it's still under consideration. It has a fairly long process in the government, so I don't think it's fair to ask Janki to commit something on this. But the good news is it's there. I think the good news is it's there.
Yes.
Okay, Amit has a question on post JNNURM. Mahua seems to be focused only on metro rail projects. There has been no interest in promoting urban bus services. What is the reason for this? BRT has also been completely abandoned. That is from Ranjit in Pune. You want to say something on this, Jackie?
Yes, sir. Yes. In fact, this is a concern for us also within the ministry. That's why within the ministry, the thinking is very much there to also take up the non-metro projects, especially the bus-based investments, which should go with the push from the center. BRTS, again, along with the JNNURM buses, we had the BRTS also within as part of JNNURM only. And again, we have a lot of learnings from that. So given the systems that we have within the cities and multiple stakeholders, that's the main challenge that I find. So it's not as easy as we see in the other sectors of within a municipality or a corporation. So water supply, drainage, this is all, it starts within the municipal corporation and ends within the municipal corporation. Whereas the urban transport is everywhere, but no one's baby kind of a situation. And that is the major challenge that we are finding. And the second challenge is the financial support that the cities ought to get for the urban transport services is still to come. They are still looking up to the center for uh, taking up projects on urban transport. And with BRTS, we still have good models like in Karnataka, Hubli Dharwad when it was launched. So it has a very good model, and the ridership has also shown good results. And again, the results has varied from city to city. What is required is a consistent focus on the urban transport within the cities. And second thing, to bring together all the stakeholder agencies. And the third thing is the consistent financial support also. Different cities have to invent a model on how to bring this investment from within the city with the state government and the different models that they have to evolve. So central government just is not enough to make this happen. But however, the thought within the ministry is still very much alive for bringing focus back on non-metro based transport services as well.
Let me add a bit to this. In fact,
Sir.
the ministry did come up with what they called a metro rail policy, but when I read that policy, it is really focused on, a very stringent set of conditions under which metros would come up. I mean, they didn't call it a non-metro policy, they called it a metro rail policy. But the idea was that if you make it difficult for someone to build a metro, they'll start looking at other systems. There, I feel that part of the problem is not just at the national government, part of the problem is also at the state governments, who seem to find the metros more attractive than other forms. And at least from my own experience with the BRT system, what has happened with the BRT in many states where it has started but hasn't gone forward, I think much more is the state. Why are the states not taking interest in the BRT systems? That would be a question I would also sort of ask. But moving ahead, a few more questions. Subsidized transport for all segments will be a big challenge going ahead. Most of the taxpayers' money utilized for this burn. How best can we get rid of this? Also, we need to have one nation, one permit. That's a question from Utkarsh. And another question from Kriti is, can speakers comment on city-controlled public bus services versus state-controlled public bus services? I'll request Mr. Ramurthy to respond to this one.
Interesting, sir. Sir, this one thing what we have seen across in all different occasions is the expertise we have seen. Even Pune Municipal Transport, PNCT, I went there, I visited, and then some of the city corporations which operate. For them, this priority, and then it is on a, it is not on the first side prioritized part for the transport. Whereas for an STU, they take equal responsibility in operating the buses, and then they are very professional in this. What we can see across the countries that where all the STUs are operating the city services, there is a fantastic service. Maybe you can take Coimbatore or even Bangalore city. Mangalore, we are also operating with the private competition. And then Hyderabad and even Tamil Nadu, Chennai. We are all, especially in the south, even to some extent in BEST because it's from municipality. Otherwise, I think more or less where all the STUs are operating, they are doing very well. with their support from the main organizations. Their professionalism is mainly there. And then the cost of operation might be a little bit on a higher side because of the overheads, but the reliability and other things is really good in the southern states. Only thing is everybody will object to this because of the higher cost of the operations due to other overheads. Otherwise, I think the STUs are operating in a good way. And recently, one more thing is in BMTC, we have tried with no additional cost of operating the BRTS with the Volvo buses. One full line was operated with the Volvo buses as a BRTS. Only the marking was done, and then there was a shift of more than 15 to 20% increase in the load factor was there. Only thing is the government has supported, especially the commissioner took the interest, and then the chief secretary was in total supportive for this action. Within a short time, I think just before the lockdown also, within a short time, this lane becomes so popular that there was a shift over, and then the time saving was almost to the extent of 40%. So that's why I think the government has to take up, even with the available facilities itself, there can be a big change made, especially in BRTS. And then once we are confirmed about this BRTS installations, benefits and other things, we can start adding the better buses along with the existing buses, like even we can tractor trailer buses, and then the big buses like which we have an air conditioned Volvo buses and all for the people we can operate, sir. BRTS is going to be a really a good solution. Maybe it's a only policy decision, sir. If there is a government support, I think STUs or any city as such will be able to implement it very happily, full-heartedly, I can say.
Good. Janki, you want to add something to that?
Yes, sir. With JNNR, we also had this reform of constituting SPVs within the city governments to run the bus services. So we have a lot of learning around that also, because at the end of the day, any type of organization, the strength will depend on its how organized it is, and the kind of support it has financially and in human resource also. So while we created these SPVs within the state governments, most of it remained on paper, but whatever became functional also, unfortunately, these two areas were not focused on. So again, when I mentioned the third category of cities, the second category of cities which took off and where there was focus from the state government as well, then they could do well. Like the Bhopal SPV is still doing a fairly good job. But the others mostly remained on papers, and the funding was not there because STCs, the RTCs are always associated with the state government departments and the funding, though they also suffer, but had the monitoring and support from the state governments, but the SPVs did not have that, whereas the city governments also didn't have any resources to support them. So at the end of the day, I feel it is how much the state government focuses on the subject of urban transport as such. Once if the state government understands the importance it brings to a city development and brings in the investment that is required, then I think whatever the structure, we could work out on that.
Okay, thanks, Janki. Now, there are a couple of other questions. Let me just read them out all together and give both of you a minute each before we wind up. We don't have too much time.
Yeah, sure, sir.
One of the questions is in terms of financial resourcing. Would centralized support prove more successful or private investment? That's one question. The other question from Sridhar Chari is Mahua considering concessional finance from development agencies? We have seen that interest rates can be less than 1% for certain states availing of such funding. Interesting question. Another interesting question is, developing a bus-based system is an OPEX-focused project, unlike metro rail that is CAPEX-focused. If governments need to take bus-based systems forward, they will have to look beyond bus procurement in the operations phase. Any thinking from government on this direction? I think all the questions are related to government now. I'm a private individual. I'll leave it to both of you to take a minute each and say something on these broadly.
Yes, sir. Basically, it is the thinking which has been going on, and even with FAME, we have clearly moved away from the public ownership to PPP models. So, and that is clearly the way forward. There is no alternate to that. And again, when we talk about PPP, there are two risks mainly, and the two models, the broad models, GCC and NCC, where the revenue risk and the operations risks are both with the operator in NCC, and only the operations risk is with the operator in the GCC. Clearly, both the models have advantages and disadvantages, but the direction that we have taken rightly is on the GCC, because at the end of the day, one thing is that the state or the city, the public authorities cannot shy away from the capital investments on creating the necessary infrastructure to run these operations. Be it the procurement of buses or building that within GCC, or the creation of depots and things like that, the bus stops and other things. So even when we were thinking within the ministry for the bus-based transport services, so clearly the GCC model is what we had in mind. But within that, whether governments should support the procurement of buses, or whether it should be built within the GCC for the procurement of buses, is what we could decide based on how the cities opt for and the financial strength that they have. But clearly the direction is towards PPP, and there is no alternate to it.
Mr. Ramurthy, a minute.
Yes, sir. I would like to finally say that either it could be GCC or whatever it is, sir. For an organizations, either it's a SPV or a municipal corporation or whatever it is, investment on the buses will not be a big thing, because now several banks have come out, and then several funding agencies have also come out with funding of the buses. Only question is, when we go for an urban operations, the operational cost is the question. One may be over a period of time, the GCC model also, with the labor cost increase, the driver cost and other things, their operational efficiency may not match, but there is always a difference, because ours being if it is run by either municipality or a SPV or a government organizations, the staff cost will be on higher side, because they are more betterly paid than the other drivers and other things. But they are also being from the society. I think we keep people more happy by doing this. But only thing is, it's between the two. If an STU or an SPV is able to operate with the same level of efficiency up to the required marking, I mean to say that satisfactory level, I think it's a via media, so that opportunity is also not lost for the government undertakings, and also an opportunity is also given for private organizations also. Only thing is, we should have the best infrastructure, wherein the government supports for an infrastructure, and also the operational efficiency can be improved using the latest ITS systems, and then timings and other things, and then the payment models and all those things, which will save a lot of time. I think this modernization will bring in a lot of big change in the transport system. We can, at least in the days to come, and then going ahead with this.
Thanks very much. Now, I have been authorized by Amit that I can take a few more questions. So if there's anyone else who would like to put in a question, do put it in your chat. I'll take, okay. This is from Shripad Vaikar. Shripad, good to see you are here. Is there any priority plan for bus infrastructure like depots and terminals? One of the learnings from the JNNURM was in absence of depots, bus life was very short. Now, let me give a little background because I was there at that time. This is the focus on the JNNURM bus funding scheme, as I mentioned earlier, was primarily enable an offtake from the auto industry's stocks. So that's why the big question was, how do we get more buses procured? That was, the motivation in the background of the recession. Obviously, there wasn't enough money available at that time to fund both the buses and the infrastructure, because as you know, the bus funding scheme came in only something in 2008, whereas the JNNURM itself was launched in 2005. So this really came in later on. So this became a problem, but I think this is a lesson to be learned going forward. If a new program is to come up, this lesson probably should come in there. Personally, if you ask my opinion, I feel that yes, I think the right approach is that public funds should be used for creating the infrastructure. We should use private sector for bringing in the buses and operating those buses. But as far as financing is concerned, one thing that many STUs have not looked at. Here, I'm not talking of BMTC or KSRTC, but many STUs have not looked at is the kind of resources that they have to be able to raise funds from other sources. Things like the property that they own. Are there innovative ways in which their property can be exploited to give them additional sources of revenue so that you don't have to perpetually keep depending on the government to give you an OPEX support? I think that is something that needs to be looked at very carefully. This will not only provide money through exploitation of your resources, of your land resources, for example, but also give you higher ridership. I think that itself will be another kind of a thing to look at. So, and the last session that we will move to later on, one of the things that we should be looking at is this financing. Where is the money going to come from? Will the government continue to be able to fund this? I honestly don't call it a subsidy. The way I look at it is when governments contribute towards, a bus service or a metro service kind of thing, I would avoid using the word subsidy. I would raise the question of who should pay for public transport. Is the public transport to be paid only by the user of the system, or is it to be paid for by other beneficiaries of the system who are not otherwise contributing just because they're not using? Is there a way by which we can raise resources even from them? To me, that's not subsidy. That is every beneficiary paying for public transport. That kind of money coming in, to my mind, all public transport systems will be sustainable financially. So subsidy somehow doesn't have a good connotation. I think beneficiary paying is a connotation we should be looking at. Meanwhile, I have another question from Ranjit. But PPP will need much more robust regulatory authority. Privatization in other sectors led to strengthening of their sector. Regulators, TRI, etc. This needs to be considered by the center and states. You're absolutely right. This is where you need to look at what is the role of the state transport corporations or the state transport undertakings. From being an operator of services, can we think of putting them down as regulators of services? This is some kind of thing. I'm not saying that this is what should be done, but I think some kind of thinking around that. You can't have PPP without good regulation, and a regulator needs to come in. Absolutely right. One other question that has come in is from Ameg Gopinath. What are the current challenges that the ministry and various STUs are facing in bringing data and innovations to improve bus planning and operations in India? I'll pass it on to you, Mr. Ramurthy.
Yes, sir. This is a very good question. Really, yes. This is this is the main bottleneck any STUs are facing actually. Whenever, even in spite of so many years of experience and other things, what we do, there are only three things are here. One is the demand, one is the supply, and also the frequency. Considering these three, and then the resources to match all these three. All the STUs, most of the time, the only thing is the resource. We can plan definitely, but only thing is we are still into using the Excel sheets and then doing it manually. The planning systems, we are not using a high-end tools for improvement of the bus planning. We go to any STUs, I will check with my other colleagues also. We keep using only the old system of checking the frequencies manually and doing it. And most of the STUs, there is a lot to do with the rather ERP solutions or tools used for planning and other things. That is one requirement, sir. And then the second one is maybe what we use, call it as what we use in ERP solutions, the database management, and then the previous data to be used for planning further, and then the real-time data. All these things, even maybe a ticketing system of which has got all the database of day-to-day ticket systems and then the revenue realized. All these things are not integrated to a single system, and we don't have a single common tool wherein I will be able to get on a dashboard all these things to plan on day-to-day basis. Even though we do a lot of planning also, most of the STUs are facing a crisis, or I can say that maybe due to infrastructure or maybe due to resource crunch or whatever it is. We have never invested onto all these things. But once we do it, I think this will bring in a very big change. It is worth investing for all these things, especially for planning our schedules. We generally don't plan properly at all. Next month, we keep running the same schedules. And then by the time we realize that these schedules are not lucrative or it needs change and all, we have already lost a big money. I think all STUs on seriously think on planning the schedules and then making a study of all the schedules, use the database effectively, and also we need to do a lot of planning based on the uh, tools like what we use, planning and scheduling tools, what we use it in Europe, whatever it is that may not be directly usable, but we have to customize it and use it. So that will bring in a big change, especially doing all this. Maybe automated ticketing systems also totally will also bring in a lot of good change there. E-ticketing systems and then cashless transactions and all these things can see a big change and help STUs also to bring down the cost, because we are spending a lot of money on the time and money is being spent for the ticket issue. I think if the government supports us a lot, especially in this area, in addition to the investment on the buses, rolling stock and other things, save a lot of time and then improve the efficiency, sir.
Thanks very much. I think the basic message that you are giving to Janki and Amit and Vivek is that put together a really solid capacity building program for
Yes,
all STUs around how do you use modern technologies in bus operations. I think
Yes,
this will be, I will say, for Amit and Vivek to think about, and I'm sure Janki will be very happy to support something of this sort. But to my mind, it's absolutely great thing to do. Two other quick questions. Amit, do I have a few more minutes? Amit, do we have a couple of other minutes? Two other questions, at least I want to read them out.
We can take a couple of minutes.
Okay. So this is from Monica in SPA. How did we incorporate lessons from the JNNURM to present schemes going on under the Smart Cities mission or Amrut in terms of funding or phasing of the project? That is one. I'll take this to you, Janki. The other is from Prashant. Whenever we speak of financing public transport, there is a tendency to sound as if it is being a favor to the STUs. The question really is, why is the government continuing to raise so much revenue from public bus systems in terms of taxes? Okay, and then Prashant again. Further, I think the discussion should move to the question of subsidy given to the private vehicle users versus the tax burden that is levied on the bus users. Okay, these are the three questions. Amit, we'll end after I've given Janki and Mr. Ramurthy another minute each, and then we can move on to the next session. You may want to think of either moderating it yourself till, but Janki, you, and then Mr. Ramurthy.
Yes. So just to touch upon the previous question also, the for any city to move on to PPP model also, one of the prerequisites would be to have a robust ITS system in place. So that starts the everything, that will put everything in place, and just not having the system, as you mentioned, sir, the capacity also has to be built within the system so that everybody is on board on what the system is about and what the system can deliver for the future also. So that is one thing, and the learning from GNRM definitely has been built into when the smart city mission and Amrut was designed. Mainly in the categorization of projects and the funding also. So it was, one thing is it was demand based scheme, both the missions, the smart city mission and the Amrut, where the capacity of this, the states and the cities were focused upon. And then if you take Amrut, we did not wait for the 5 years to complete to wait for the projects to come in. Within a 1 year, all the action plans from the states was obtained and sanctions were given. So the rest 4 years was left to the states just for the implementation. So I think that was the major change. I'm not restricting here only to the bus projects, but the overall learning from JNN.
Thanks, Janki. Mr. Ramurthy, quick
Thank you, sir.
comment and then we'll wind up.
Yes, sir. This is, as said, always when the funding happens to the STU, it always looks like a rather what is favored to the STU. But I'm not favoring, I'm not just to support the STU, sir, even as a private bus user also, unless they're supported by good infrastructure and then the facilities, I think the public transport cannot become popular. And any day, even because the investments towards the metro and then the connectivity towards all extensions and all, we see that any day this last mile connectivity, public transport, either an STU or a private bus public transport can play a major role. And then a lot has to happen in providing the infrastructure. So the government can really address it through a good ITS system in place and also the infrastructure. These two can play a major role, and modernization especially. And the last thing to say, which has got highest priority, is the ITS and other systems in place, integration of different modes of transport. All these things, once it happens, even at, see, we always concentrate on only 5 cities like tier 1, whenever we go, either Delhi, Bombay, Hyderabad and all. But a lot of economic activities are also happening at tier 2 cities, which we generally neglect. It still look like a village only. It's an improvised village only. We don't provide any good facilities to them. Now the smart cities which are there in place, maybe 100 cities which we, it may come out, it may, the work may progress may slowly because of this COVID, but still this transportation, if it is given an importance, irrespective of whether an STU or an SPV, that can play a major role in bringing up the city into smart, sir, and bring a big change in economic activity.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We are well past our time. So let me first start by thanking Janki and Mr. Ramurthy for sparing your time to join us. I thought the discussions were extremely useful. I enjoyed listening to all of you. I also enjoyed the questions that came up. Thanks to all of you who participated in this and the questions. Thank you very much. Let me now pass it back to Amit. Over to you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thanks for this opportunity.
Thank you, sir. Thank you to WRI and also Shakti. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you to all the participants for listening to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Janki ma'am. Thank you, Ramurthy sir. And thank you, OP sir. So we had a session with Mr. Dario Hidalgo, who was supposed to join us from Bogota, but I think there are some connectivity issues. We hope he will join me soon. But I think we will take this opportunity to get a slightly different perspective on the same ongoing conversation. And so we heard from Janki ma'am from what the national government is thinking. We also heard from Mr. Ramurthy from a public operator on some of the points. But as we spoke, that almost 90% buses in India are held by private sector. So what's the private sector's perspective on the same topic? And so for this, we have Mr. Prasanna Patwardhan, who is the chairman of Purple Mobility. He's managing director of Purple Mobility. He's also the chairman of Bus Operators Confederation of India. So welcome, Mr. Prasanna. Very quickly, your reflection on JNURM and bus funding scheme. What are big takeaways from a private operator perspective, and what are some of the lessons that you learned from operating buses in so many cities in India? So Prasanna, you have to unmute yourself.
I think you're on mute, Prasanna.
Unmute.
Yes, we can hear
You're,
you.
you're okay.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
We can hear you and we can see you also. So fantastic.
Okay, good. So thank you very much, WRI, for giving me this opportunity. So first and foremost, as you were discussing, that what are the learnings from JNURM or past whatever schemes we had. So when we talk about public transport, I believe first thing what we need to do, we need to forget about this public operator, STUs, private operators, and differentiate between these two, because unless both of them they come together, this problem is not going to go away. So there are certain inbuilt strengths in STUs. At the same time, there are certain inbuilt strengths in private operators. So if both these strengths are utilized, then only we will get better public transportation systems in our country. I'll start from financing first. So because you were discussing about financing. So as far as financing is concerned, I think what is more important today is getting finance for vehicle is very easy for private operators. So government did not actually invest into buses. Why, I don't know. Traditionally, we have been investing in buses through STUs because that is the lowest hanging fruit, and that requires a different kind of skill set to run the buses, which is available in private as well as public. But the kind of skill set what STUs has or which they can develop, that can never be developed by private operators, which is planning from the beginning. With the help of government, STUs have inherent advantage of being a government organization. So last about 30-40 years, the kind of manpower which they have, that kind of manpower is not available anywhere outside. Because though 90% of the operations are handled by private operators, that scale and that skill to manage entire city is not available with private. So let us be very honest that that skill is available with STUs, and they should utilize that skill to the maximum. So when it comes to planning, even STUs are outdated in terms of their planning. So for planning, we require different kind of technology to be used, different kind of techniques to be used. So and there are private agencies also available outside, those who can give excellent planning inputs to STUs. And STUs going forward will have to develop that capacity within themselves. Though today, I'm sorry to say this, many people may not like it, that they say they have that planning capacity, but honestly speaking, that capacity is seriously lacking. Because whatever they plan, that plan is continuously used for several years without any change. And in dynamically changing society, it is not right that same plan you keep on using for years together. So first is planning. In terms of planning, it can be outsourced or it can be developed in-house also. Second is development of infrastructure. The kind of infrastructure what these STUs have, nobody has. But they are not utilizing that infrastructure or space, whatever they have available today, to its optimum capacity. Because all these depots or bus stations are very designed 50 years, 30 years, 20 years back, and they are not being more efficient. So those kind of infrastructure development also they can do. And now with electromobility coming in, a different kind of infrastructure again is required, which needs to be developed in any case. When it comes to operations, if you divide that into, one is revenue collection and second is operation of hardcore operation of buses. So I think private operators are better equipped, and that does not mean, I am not saying that STUs are not well equipped, but when you have other assistants, other partner who is equally expert in handling that part of the business, why not hand it over to you? Because when you say that I will do everything, then you forget about your quality, you forget about audit. So if I am doing it by myself, I will never criticize myself. So it is very important that this part of the operations are handled by private. Revenue collection also, now there are specialized agencies also coming up, which will focus mostly onto revenue collection. So marketing, brand building, revenue collection, this also requires a special different skill set, which partially is available with STUs, but marketing and brand building is probably unknown to them. It's a new territory which they will have to enter into. After that, when it comes to hardcore operation, fleet management, I think private people are very much well equipped to handle that kind of situation. And once this operation starts, then what is important is to ensure that quality of operation is maintained. So here, maintaining quality, then audit, ensuring that everything is happening as per the schedule, taking customer feedback, then again making some changes according to feedback. So that also is a different skill, and STUs can do it by themselves, or they can also outsource it by themselves to some outside agency. STU's main job is to coordinate everybody. I can give you example where I work in Indore. They have very skeleton job manpower, but still they are able to do whatever best they can do, only because they have coordinated all private operators, including technology partner, branding partner, then operating partners. So all this coordination job is, which is, I believe, is the most important job. STU should do that job, and I'm sure they can do it well because they have a really very good manpower. I am not ashamed to say that whatever good manpower even I have, they are retired officers from STUs. So, but their possessiveness about keeping all this business to themselves is actually hindering development of our public transport in our country. They want to do everything by themselves, and I don't know why they are so much in love with running their vehicles by own. But if they do it otherwise, it would be a good thing to have. So just to summarize this, I think finances, as far as acquisition of asset is concerned, there is no issue. But when it comes to finances of viability gap funding, which is very, very important, which is totally lacking, I don't see that budgeted in any city's budget or state's budget. So it is always ad hoc. STUs are getting funded by states to some extent, to the extent that they don't die. And that entire budgeting, that entire financing happens when they are almost on the verge of dying. So financing should happen beforehand, not after once you go into ICU. So that financing mechanism has to be put in place. For that to be put in place, you need to have annual budget ready. I don't know how many STUs they do annual budget, and accordingly government sanctions viability gap funding. But this is one of the important factor which is required. Public-private partnerships are not being very successful, I would say. And one of the reasons for that not being very successful is payment terms and the way this concession agreement is drafted. Concession agreement has to be drafted in a balanced way. It has to be drafted in such a way that good financial institutions are ready to invest into this kind of projects. If you take example of road development projects, now international agencies are coming up and investing in those companies. In India, even today, I got my first private equity in 2009. even after 11 years, there is no other private equity which has invested in public transport, any identity of public transport. So serious question to be asked is why this is happening. So unless we have a robust concession agreement backed by good infrastructure, good financial arrangement to provide people money on time, and backed by quality assured team, public transport scenario in our country would not change. And it is high time that we take cognizance of this. And going forward, both the operators, whether it is public or private, come together and find a path which will take India forward. So thank you, Amit. Thank you for listening to me patiently.
Thank you, Mr. Prasanna. I think two questions which came, one from Hemant AR and other from Anjula Negi on PPP, and you answered in the question on your opening statement. One quick question which is from my side, and a very quick answer is, so we started with net cost and then we kind of graduated to gross cost. As a private operator, what's been your experience for last decade or so on the two models of operation? What works, what did not work? Very quick reaction to this question.
So one quick sentence I would say, in net cost contract, you don't earn money. In gross cost contract, you don't get money. So net cost contract, once allocated, given, government is least bothered about how that operator is operating, quality of that operation, whether he survives or not survives. And when it comes to gross cost contract, once that concession agreement is given, getting a payment is so difficult that operators struggle. So both these things, both type of contracts for suitable city conditions can be applied, but provided both are treated equally.
And any one or two main takeaways that you would reflect from JNURM as a private operator? What can be very quickly can be looked at as we move to the next round of as we contemplate a next bus funding scheme?
So as I said, the JNRM, the main issue was there were no private operators or takers for many cities, and mainly because there was no assurance of payment. If at all, there is a viability. In a net cost contract, old systems which keep on running in the city, which STUs also face the same problem. But in case of STUs, there is some kind of government support at least. But when it comes to private, there is absolutely zero support from government for net cost contract. So gross cost contract is the way forward in our country. That is what I have started believing, though my belief 10 years back was different. But now I have started believing that in our country, gross cost contract is the best model to operate. And in gross cost contract, if that budget is allocated, viability gap funding is assured, then you will get very good operators. And concession agreement, second, as I said, concession agreement in JNRM, different concession agreements were given in different cities, and all those were lopsided. At the end of the agreement, they will say MD's decision is final. So that means whatever you have written on top has no value. So concession agreement, we had a meeting, we had a committee formed by MOUD at that point of time to come up with standard concession agreement. So 3 standard concession agreements were drafted, published: gross cost, net cost, and hybrid. But not many cities or even STUs opt for those 100% adhered to those concession agreements. And that is where the problem starts. If you are remaining selfish while entering into partnership, that partnership will never last. So it has to be a balanced kind of concession agreement. So concession agreement, funding of viability gap funding, and unnecessary funding buses, which is very easy to fund for private, rather than utilize that money to give viability gap funding. So if these 2-3 things are changed, then I see. And infrastructure also was missing in many cities. So that is also one of the area wherein many operators were not happy operating in those cities.
Thank you, Mr. Prasanna. I think you really summarize it well. One, I think the right contract structure. Second, viability gap funding. And third, something to do with infrastructure would be really crucial. So I think with this 3 important takeaways, we will move to the next session, which is towards the National Investment Program for Public Transport in India. Again, Dr. Agarwal will chair the session, and we'll have speakers with Mr. Ravi Pandit from KPIT Technologies, Gerald Oliver from the World Bank, Professor Shivanand Swamy, and I will request Mr. Prasanna if you could stay and join the next session. So over to you, Mr. Agarwal.
Thanks, Amit. It was a pleasure to listen to Prasanna as always. I think the way you put it down as 2 things that I really take away is the STUs have the capacity for planning, which the private sector does not have. And the private sector has the strength for being able to buy buses and operate buses, which is perhaps, has an advantage over the public sector in doing this. The second one that I liked was in the net costs, you don't earn money. In a gross cost, you don't get money. I think that speaks a lot. That is absolutely right. I mean, from the experiences that I've seen, that has been coming from the conversations I've been having with you also. I think that is really putting it very nicely. And that's where having a good, solid, robust concession agreement where both parties are equally responsible for making sure that they fulfill their part of the obligations. And both parties are penalized for not fulfilling their part of the agreement. It cannot be one-sided. I think that is something that is very important. But now let me move on to the next session. It's great to see Gerald, great to see Professor Swamy. Professor Swamy is someone we all learn from as we keep going along. Gerald is a very dear friend of mine. Very good to see him and all of you. I think the main thing I would like to think of here is when we move towards a new public transport funding scheme. As we move towards a new public transport funding scheme, I think we should also. Oh, lovely, Mr. Pandit has also joined us. So very nice to see you. So as we move towards the new scheme, I think certain things or certain global developments that have happened in this entire scheme of operating public bus services, it will be good for us to take note of them. First is, it is really a coming together of the public sector and the private sector into providing bus services. You start with London, where they reformed their bus services, to many other countries around the world. The basic message that they picked up was, while the public sector is good at planning bus services, while the public sector should be there to ensure public good, it is not necessary for the public sector to really be involved in operating these services, something that the private sector can do well. So one is, how do we separate planning from operations through a meaningful contract? That is one. The second thing that has been coming up is, obviously, in doing this, what kind of good regulatory structures do you have to make sure that these contracts are being adhered to, and these contracts are, if not honored, there are penalties which come up. A third element that has started coming up globally is, it's not one mode and another mode. It is an integrated public transport system. So how do we bring about an integration? Maybe by integrating systems, integrating infrastructure, integrating fares, integrating the governance systems. So all of that, how do you come up with an integrated system? And finally, the other thing that is, the last thing that is coming up in a very big way is, how do you finance these kind of services? Is it only out of user fees, that means fares, or are there other ways in which you can finance these bus services? So let me just set this as a broad thing that is happening around the world. And in the context of that, what is it that a new public transport funding initiative from the government of India could look like? We had some discussions on whether it should fund capex or opex. There are other discussions on whether it should be only a viability gap. And if it's a viability gap, how will that be operationalized? What are the kind of reforms that need to happen? I think broadly, these are the kinds of questions that I think is posed before this panel. So with that, let me sort of, since Prasanna has just spoken, let me give him a little time to get a breather. Can I start with Mr. Pandit and then move on to Gerald, then Professor Swami, and finally come back to Prasanna? If that's okay with you, can I follow that sequence?
Sure.
Mr. Pandit.
Yeah. So thanks, Sophie, for kind of setting out the context of the session. And so what we are talking about is the National Investment Program for Public Transportation. I think the context has to be set in terms of where we are in terms of our current public transport. Now, less than 200,000 buses, 1.2 million buses aggregate, and less than 10% of them publicly owned. And you know, I mean, that is the scenario that we have. If one were to look at the public transport buses that we should have, as opposed to what we have even today a shortfall of more than 40,000. And if you look at further more urbanization, then we are looking at a shortfall of like 70,000 buses just now. So that's the context of the funding that would be required for a decent bus service. Clearly, we are looking at not the diesel or even for that matter CNG buses. So we are looking at electric buses. So I think the question to ask us is that how is it that we are going to fund this large number of electric buses? And you know, that is the question that I would like to address in my brief remarks. So I think to me, the problem statement is how can we ensure that the public finances, which in a country like ours and probably in every other country are always in short supply, how can we use that money most judiciously to give a clean, connected, adequate public transport especially in our cities. So the question is, you know, how can we minimize the requirement and how can we allocate that funding in the best possible way? And here are my thoughts. So in my opinion, the question will begin with what size buses we are looking at. Clearly, we need 9-meter or sub-9-meter buses in the cities. And there have been buses, 12-meter buses have been brought into the cities. They don't make much sense. And so we should standardize on the sizes 9-meter and sub-9-meter, because I think that can reduce the quantum of cost per bus. We had done some surveys in a few cities in the country, and we found out that if you were to compare the 12-meter bus cost and a 9-meter bus cost, if you were to add 10% extra buses in terms of numbers, the SLAs or the availability of buses goes up by almost 25%. So by putting 10% extra in number of buses, you can reduce the cost and you can increase the availability. Because currently it's a vicious circle that we are in. People don't take buses because they are not necessarily available on time and they don't come in large numbers. So I think the first thing that we need to do is we need to look at the size and go for a smaller size. The second thing is about the battery cost. As we all know that in the case of a battery electric vehicle, almost like 40% or more of the cost is of batteries. So how do you reduce the cost of these batteries? There are finally only 2 or 3 chemistries for which most of the OEMs are veering towards. Only 2-3 chemistries towards which most of the OEMs are now going. I think there should be a national buying policy for batteries. So I have seen, for example, in Japan, if the Japanese industries want to buy, say, advanced machine tools of a certain type, all the industries come together, they decide on a certain set of equipments that they need, and the industry association as such negotiates with the international suppliers so that they get a good discount. I think we need to do the same in India for buying any large-scale batteries. And we know finally it is going to be either NMC or the 2 chemistries only currently that are happening, or LFP. And if we say that this is the total number required of these types of batteries, let the international parties come and pitch, and I'm sure we can get extremely good prices on that, and we can cut down our costs quite a bit. We need also to recognize that the new battery chemistries are also coming into play, and I'm not talking about lead, but I'm talking about other chemistries such as sodium ion, for example. And we should be very much open for these kind of new chemistries which will be coming into the market shortly. In the way in which we structure the current contracts, it says that the the bus that will be accepted for say FAME 2 or FAME 3, the bus should have so many kilometers of range on a single charge, 230, 250 kilometers. To me, that doesn't make any sense. I think what should be said is that the bus should be able to operate so many kilometers in a day by normal operations, so that there could be choices about swapping, there could be choices about fast charge batteries. All of these factors can come into play. Ultimately, the objective of the city government or the government should be to ensure that clean buses run to take care of all the requirements of public transport. I don't think there is a necessity of saying that every bus should have a minimum of so much of run per charge, because the moment you are putting such restrictions, you are actually asking for larger and larger batteries to be put on the buses. Those batteries will cost more, and therefore the viability gap funding will again be required. Higher amount will be required. So I think we should put our conditions not in terms of single charge batteries, but in terms of total amount of coverage of kilometers that can be done. The next thing is the thing that was discussed just now in the earlier session, and Prasanna was quite eloquent, and so were you, OP, about it, on the public-private roles. See, I think it's very unfortunate that almost all the city governments in the country want to get engaged in the delivery of all public services. Now, whether it is transportation or solid waste management or sewerage, water provision, even education, I really don't understand why is it that the corporations should be engaged in the delivery of these services. And if you were to see even in India what has happened in the case of Telecom Regulatory Authority or in the case of even Electricity Regulatory Authority, clearly the role of the government is being differentiated from necessarily being the providers. So in my opinion, the city government should actually be engaged in defining proper contracts, in having proper service level agreements, and getting the private parties to do all the rest. I think the private parties have the funding that city governments don't have, and we heard just now that typically funding is given to the city transport undertakings when they are just about to die. In effect, you will get a funding only at the last moment. The funding will always be inadequate, and you can't blame, in our country, there are so many claimants on public finance that, who would say that, the city buses should have a higher priority than some farmers, basic living requirements. So I think we have to recognize that whatever small funding that we have, we should use it in the best way. And I think that is where you can get the private parties to come in. We have to, of course, lay down the rules properly. And we all know that that a contracting party and the judge cannot be the same. So we really need a third party authority who could say that who would would be a judge when there is a difference of opinion between a private operator and a city regulatory authority, and that the judgment should be such that decisions are quickly taken and life moves on. So I think it is important that we make a distinction between the public role and the private role. I believe that if we were to do that well, and if we come up with credible contracts, there will be a lot of investment that will be coming. We are short, as I said, by about 60, 70,000 buses. That shortage will vanish very quickly because the private funding will come in, good operators will come in. What we are now beginning to see that even amongst operators, there is a consolidation happening, which means that more and more high caliber operators are kind of coming onto the, onto the platform. So I personally believe that we should really make this open in such a way that we have a proper public-private partnership in this regard. Now, the next question is, how should the funding be given, especially when it comes to electric buses, where the fares don't justify this? So our thoughts have been, first, don't make it a capex subsidy. I think it should be an OPEX subsidy rather than a capex subsidy. And you can always convert a capex subsidy into an OPEX subsidy by ascribing certain interest rate for the delayed payments that you are making. So first, make it OPEX based, because it would ensure that every kilometer that is committed by the operator to run as an electric bus is delivered, because he'll be paid on the basis of the number of kilometers delivered. Now there is enough technology available which can ensure that whatever is stated as the number of kilometers run can be tracked, and one can easily see whether the operator has actually run those many kilometers or not. and on a per kilometer basis, he can be given a subsidy. It would be very easy to do a bidding on this basis, so as to ensure that, given a certain service level agreement, the operator who is the best managed can definitely charge the least, and therefore commit to give those kilometers, clean kilometers, to a city at the lowest cost to the city. Now the question also arises that how do we spread the money that is available? This money, which is like a public fund available for viability gap or whichever way you call it, how do you spread it across the cities? And I think it's a very interesting question to ask. Today, what is happening is that multiple cities go up and make a request to the state, to the central government, and in some way, certain money is allocated across the various cities. My own suggestion is that for that, there should be some kind of a reverse bidding by the class of cities. So we say that, A class cities have a certain rate structure, B class cities have a certain broad rate structure, and those cities who are managing their own functions well, who are asking for the least amount of gap funding, should get the highest number of buses. So automatically there would be a movement towards more efficient management of the contracts, as well as more efficient management of the overall public transport operation. And to ensure that every operator gets a subsidy in advance, the total committed subsidy for a particular year should be given at the beginning of the year as an advance, and it can be adjusted at the end of the year. So I think proper allocation of money between the cities and within the cities to the proper operators is a very critical thing to ensure that whatever limited money that is available with the state government, with the central government, is used in the most efficient way. I think an external set of contracts can be drafted to ensure that this can be made possible. Now, the last point I would like to make is that over and beyond the battery electric vehicles that we are currently looking at today, we should now start looking at fuel cell vehicles. There are, of course, multiple new tenders coming up in the fuel cell vehicles now. We personally believe that it is possible to come up with lower cost fuel cell buses in India. And some people would be surprised by it, because typically globally the cost of fuel cell buses is higher than the battery electric vehicles. But our calculations show that it should be cheaper to run a fuel cell electric bus in the country, intercity as well as intracity, than a battery electric bus. We don't see a lot of Indian capacity for manufacturing of batteries, but we see a possibility of making fuel cells as well as hydrogen in India at very competitive prices. And it is possible to come out at a situation where, if you were to compare the cost of the fuel cell and the cost of fuel, which is hydrogen, then you can give a very tough competition to battery electric vehicles, and probably even match diesel buses. So we should look at different technologies. So the point I'm trying to make is that we need to look at good contracting technologies, good thinking on economics, and good thinking of technology, both put together to solve this problem. This problem is imminently solvable in our opinion, and we badly need much better transport in our cities. Our city transportation is at a breaking point, and unless we do something like this, it cannot change. It's time that we did something about it. Thank you very much, Opi. It's my pleasure to be here on this session.
Thank you so much. Always such a pleasure to hear you. For those who are here and don't know Mr. Pandit is the chairman of KPIT Technologies. Is one of the very well functioning technologies or other companies which is doing a lot of transport technologies. It's also a privilege for us to have him as a member of our advisory committee in WRI-India. So we keep getting the benefit of his advice on many occasions. Really a privilege to hear you. Your thoughts are really phenomenal. I really liked some of those things that you mentioned about looking at 9-meter buses or sub 9-meter buses. It's something that is food for thought for many. This whole thing about the FAME scheme covering kilometers rather than battery capacity. And a very interesting thing that you brought up about what really is the role of the government. Should it be in operating services, or should it be in ensuring that services are available? I think very interesting points that you made also about the OPEX subsidy versus the CAPEX subsidy. Your idea also about fuel cell buses being of lower cost in India, something that we would really like to take forward and analyze this and see how we can make this happen. I think these are very interesting ideas. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this. Can I now move to Gerald?
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, let me first, real great pleasure to be with all of you. Sorry that I'm joining not from India and I'm not with all of you this time, but I see a lot of familiar faces. Very inspiring talk so far. And you know what I would like to do is maybe to step back and think about what could be a national bus rejuvenation program. We have been discussing for now about a year with many of you on some of the characteristics and challenges that you're experiencing and where you want to move forward. So let me briefly run you through a presentation. You know, without going and repeating what has been very well said by Amit at the beginning, you know, very short supply in buses, a trend that is really not good in terms of fleet growth compared to the alternative, growing at half the competition, low quality of service altogether, and you know, very limited public resources for a scale up. That means that you know, public operators, in particular in cities, are really on a survival mode today. You covered very well many other reasons, and you know, among those, one thing that I would mention that has not been mentioned is, of course, fares in cities are kept low, and in combination with limited government funding means that there is not enough resources to really invest or reinvest in keeping the product fresh. Also, we see in a lot of the large metropolitan areas that roadways are increasingly congested, and as such, the economics of buses drops considerably if no specific attention is put to them. So, you know, a bus running under 30 kilometers a day is never going to be a cost-effective bus. What is really new is the trauma that comes with COVID-19, and we're still at the very beginning of it. If you look at the past couple of months and you think about the next 6 months and you look at the drop in revenue during those 2 months and what is expected to be half revenue for the next 6, what you find is that if the system was to continue as it does, it would lose 1.5 lakh crore, which is beyond any scheme or program one could think of, right? So what it means is that in a sector that was traditionally not very strong financially, you're experiencing a very deep financial trauma that is going to have real consequences as to what can be mobilized, how you think moving forward about the sector. And you know, to that will be an additional concern that may be short term, but still is going to be very prevalent for the next 6 to 12 months of health of staff, health of passengers coming on board, and how to address it. Now, this is going to trigger, and I'm mentioning them in the context of a 2030 plan because I think it's quite relevant in what you're going to see moving forward and what could be an NBRP. It's going to trigger some need for adjustment on the demand side to try to spread the demand, more home-based working. It's going to require a big push on walk, cycle, and e-bike as the capacity of a bus system drops. And that's going to be a positive for buses to the extent that those are really complementary investment. In the very short time, and I'm really speaking 6 months to a year, you're going to see that the STUs or the municipal operators are not going to have a capacity with the existing fleet to carry people. First, because they have only 1/3 of the buses they really need, and then they will be in terms of their ability to carry people. So there's going to be a need to crowd in private buses in the system at a price point that makes sense for the private buses to come in and extend the services so that people can actually move according to their needs. Coupled with that, the need to improve the bus speed on streets through priority lane and to accelerate the movement that Mr. Ramamuti was mentioning toward digitization in cities. So let me then go to what would it take to really transform bus provision in India from the studies we have done so far with Mohua and Morph. You know, the first thing, and it was touched upon by Mr. Prasanna, is if you want to really be credible, an effective network needs to be planned. A lot of the network planning that took place a long time ago, based on demographics and locations that may not coincide with the situation today. I see, for example, a lot of reports are still referring to the 2011 census. I mean, a decade in a country rapidly changing like India is very, very transformational in terms of the patterns and the movement. So the use of big data to plan an effective network will be quite critical. Second, it's very clear that although, you know, STUs and municipal companies do have some strengths, and some of them stand out in terms of their efficiency, there is certainly ground for further squeezing the efficient delivery of services. We found in the study we were carrying out with Morph, you know, 10, 15, 20%, depending on the city in terms of opportunity to squeeze. Although that depends, you know, the MTCs of this world or BMTCs are quite advanced already in terms of performance, but the opportunity to squeeze the cost of service delivery will be a second element that is fundamental. And combined with that, the equation that has never been addressed under GNRM, which remains at the very center of what is needed for the system to be sustained, is a combination between the fare, a regular fare increase. I use subsidy, and maybe I should have said a grant based on what OP mentioned earlier, and non-fare revenues, all combined, should be providing the support required behind those GCC contracts that we were discussing, right? We have to be very careful of not saying we enter a GCC contract and then we'll figure out how it gets paid. Actually, before you enter a GCC contract, the question is, how will it be paid, from which sources, over not 1 year, but over the duration of a contract, which typically is going to be 10 years. So by doing that, you can unlock a lot of the efficiency that comes with the system. The next point, and that's maybe the most important if we are thinking about the program for 2030, is moving from running buses to focusing on customers. And that's something that, as we went through many discussions with the STUs, has clearly not been the focus in the past, simply because the resources were scarce and the focus was on, you know, keep the bus running. Now, the opportunity one has when thinking about the next national bus rejuvenation program is to think about what level of service we really want to deliver in cities in India by 2030. And it's going to be very different from the level of service that you have today. It's not about quick fixing the STUs or others. It's about transforming the type of service quality that people need, because their expectations are shifting very rapidly and the system needs to adjust accordingly. To do that is going to require a combination of intervention. National government, in our view, both Mohua and Morph and NETIOG will be required to push for a program that is sizable and include both the non-motorized transport component and the bus scaling up through STU, through MTC, through municipal corporation and the like. The state will have to play the key role. Ultimately, the vision for mobility belongs to the states. They have to think about, you know, where they want to go, what level of service they want to deliver, and what resources will be allocated to that end. And last but not least, essential to the scalability, as the STUs move to the role of planner, regulator, organizer, as was described before, the private operator can come in and provide a lot of the actual services under contract with very clear KPI that show how you link to the vision I mentioned earlier. So looking at where we are, I mean, 3 months ago, we had a conference discussing that with many STUs. And then we realized that today we need to add the phase 0 to a national bus rejuvenation program. A phase 0 that is important in terms of looking at how to ensure that over the next 6 months to a year, the bus system remains important, remains effective and makes it safe for people to move back to public transport. If this is missed, then the entire trajectory will be impacted very significantly. And we have the tools today to do so, right? You can think about the type of SOPs being introduced by companies, bus operators right now, and you could think about a green label for the country, confirming the application of those, the digital tools to pay, to track your buses, and of course, all the hygiene improvement that come with making the bus safer for staff and passengers. Then an NBRP phase 1, which would take those states that have defined a vision, a state level bus transport strategy or urban mobility strategy, put in place operational arrangements that will allow the system to work, right? It's not just having a GCC contract, it's to have the entire mechanic, be it ITS or staffing, that is able to manage effectively the contract and that gives confidence to the operators coming in that they will be paid. The funding that I mentioned earlier and the ITS platform coming as a combination and making it happen. So the phase 1 could be looking at a first set of states that are ready to act on those 5 pillars and essentially support them both in the implementation of the reform and in supporting funding, which is the essential component that needs to be covered, because the capex, as was mentioned a number of times, is a small percentage of the total cost of operation for buses. And then if phase 2, learning from the phase 1, that would then scale up to other states that have made progress in the meantime. Why it matters? I think it's always good to have numbers in mind. So if you just run a quick analysis on 25,000 buses being delivered through this kind of program under phase 1, you're looking at massive savings compared to the alternative for people. You're looking at efficiency gain in the range of 11,000 crore per annum in vehicle operating costs, safer cities, greener transport, and private investment coming in the sector. So without going into too much detail on each of the aspects, I just want to go back to the comment. I just want to go back to some of the questions that were raised by OP in terms of what makes a difference between the GNRM and what could be a new program. At the core is the vision, the key performance indicators that are going to become the anchor to judge whether the system is delivering or not, and will provide the accountability for the funding that goes into the system. Then there is the question of looking at not a one-year budgeting process, because any GCC contract you are entering into as a STU would be, a 10-12-year contract. So how do you create, clear business plan vis-a-vis the public authority that fund the viability gap, so that you know with certainty that you're going to have the resources to pay and back the contract that will be coming through. We touch upon some of the contracting aspects. So the contract is only one small part, actually, maybe the easiest part to be handled. The other part is how the contract is actually managed. Is there a trusted relationship between the parties? Is there a mechanism that guarantees the payment so that you know through an escrow account that payment will be made in due time, and vis-a-vis the bank, you're going to be able to meet your EMI as a private operator. So, what could be the outline of a NBRP in our view? It would be a combination of a core grant that would be supporting the type of deep transformation that is required for the service delivery to up its game to where India wants to be by 2030, and to make some of the transformation that are required in the institutions. Second, for these states that have moved forward with a vision and the other components I mentioned, a performance outcome grant that will support the part of the viability gap funding between cost of the GCC and the actual revenue collected from users, and maybe provide some guarantee scheme that securitize for the private operators that payment will be done on time, which is really a factor that impacts a lot their access to capital and the cost of capital on their end. We see the need for ITS support to be, at the core of most of this work, because ultimately that's what brings all of the components together, from the planning to the execution to the monitoring and payments. And then with that, I would just want to conclude with some of the aspects of risk management that one may want to keep in mind. When working with the states, it's absolutely fundamental to leverage on the new technology that Mr. Prasanna was mentioning earlier, right? There's the network planning is a very different discipline today than it was even 5 years ago. The opportunity to actually embed in the NBRP good quality planning would be essential. Second, the availability of funding is what kills or make a system work, and that dependability is really what needs to be ensured upfront, not just for the signing of a contract, but for the longer term, together with measures to secure the payments. Staff will always be concerned over contracting, because traditionally you're impacting the role they have played when you're in an STU. So the first step can be for STUs to become contractualizing their own service with similar KPIs, so that they learn the discipline of transforming and strengthening a performance-based delivery for the resources that they would be receiving from the state. This is the kind of conversations we are having with MTC. And last but not least, a lot of this, from the planning to the contract management, etc., is actually quite new. So there is a need for a very comprehensive capacity building program that would be supporting all of this. So with that, I will turn back to you, Opi.
So Olivia, thanks very much for this outstanding presentation and giving us an outline of the NBRP as you see it. I, for one, of course, my personal opinion, I think it's a very good structure that you've laid out with, some kind of core funding, some kind of performance-based funding, clearly a needed support for ITS and capacity building, and also the implementation support. I think I can only wish you the very best and hope this goes through, because to us, I think this is of critical importance. For those who don't know Gerald, Gerald is the lead transport specialist at the World Bank. He has very good credentials to be telling us what's happening around the world. He by himself is a French gentleman. He has very strong connections with Korea. He's worked in Singapore, now working in India. So I think he brings us a wealth of experience from many countries around the world. So I think it's really good that Gerald is here with us. Thanks a ton, Gerald. This is outstanding. I, for one, love this capacity building component, because for many, many years, I've felt that the most important thing that we need to attend to is capacity building. The multiplier effect of this is huge, yet it's not glamorous to do. It is glamorous to talk about, but nothing really happens on this. So I'm glad you're putting this as one of the components. To me, that's certainly one of the most important. So thanks, Gerald. Let me now move to Professor Swami. Shivanand.
We can move it. This presentation. Screenshot. Just 1 second, sir. I'll just upload.
No problem. If we can hear you, we know that you are there, so it's fine. Meanwhile, Professor Swami, while he's putting his screen, he's a professor at the CEPT University, but that's not saying all about him. The one thing I keep saying about Shivanand is that no BRT in India has succeeded unless it has had his blessings. Unless he has touched the BRT, it hasn't gone forward. I call him the Midas of BRTs in India. So whether you take Ahmedabad, or Surat, or Rajkot, or Hubli, Dharwad, these are the 4 really successful models of BRT. All of them has his hand. And I don't know, out of the 287 people that are there now on this, I guess more than 100 or 150 have been his students. We're all his students in many ways. A lot that we've learned from him. I'm hoping to pick up more today. Problem still? Do you need some more time? Should I move to Prasanna and then come back?
Hello.
Yes.
Something. Sir, you can hear me?
Yes, yes, we can hear you.
Oh, then I think I'll go on, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. And it's always a pleasure listening to you, Gerald, Prasanna, and I think Pandit. It's good presentations made, and much has already been said. I will, sir, this is the electric bus in the picture, what you see in Ahmedabad. And this is a midi bus and carries about 60 people. I think that's an interesting thing which happens only in India. PT, I don't have to re-emphasize.
I think your screen is stuck. Do you want to?
Sir, now?
I don't know. What are the others able to see his screen properly? I can see the screen, but it seems to be stuck on the side of way forward. So you probably want to click on your first slide and put it on the slide share mode.
Yes. Yes. Now, sir?
No.
No.
Why don't you, or otherwise, why don't you just go ahead? Let's not, if you have the screen to you.
Yes, I can do that, sir.
Just sort of, do it as an audio. Now it's come. Okay. Now all you have to do is click on the screen share, the full screen thing at the bottom of this. Okay. This is good. Now go to the first slide.
First slide. This is not the one.
This is
not the one. I'm sorry, sir. Sorry about this.
No problem. No problem. We have.
This is a presentation. Okay, the first slide. Is it fine, sir?
Yes, this is fine.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. All right, sir. Am I audible, sir?
Yes.
All
audible.
right.
Perfect.
Yes. Yeah. I just wanted to show this bus. This is the first electric bus which Ahmedabad started playing, made by Ashok Leyland, and
It's a 9-meter bus and carries about 50-60 people, although its capacity is quite different. And therefore, things are changing. And as is known, PT definitely is affordable, environmentally efficient, climate friendly, and space efficient transport. And therefore, why PT should not be a question. I also wanted to highlight our Surat work. There are 3 systems, all of them bus systems. You can buy one ticket, go from anywhere to anywhere else in the city, changing different buses, different routes, different modes, and to your destination, only one ticket, and you don't have to buy a ticket again and again. It's something which is happening today, and this is the most recent bus rapid transit system in Hubli Dharwad, at very sleek, very modern, and very high capacity system. I think these things are happening, but then issue is there are few of them and not many which are coming out with new innovations and moving forward in terms of the bus system. Much of it appears that we got stuck. Maybe JNNURM is a good thing. A lot of funding came out of that. Many of these BRT systems were funded through that process. I think innovations and funding innovations should definitely be the Government of India's priority agenda. But I'm not sure whether bus funding helps cities build public transport systems, because many cities today actually looking up to Government of India for purchase of new buses, because they don't want to even replace buses. They need Government of India to support that. I think this kind of a becoming dependent on the Government of India is definitely not something which one should be looking for. Therefore, the government, the new program, whenever happens, has to think of what to fund and what not to fund, what to support. I think that's the question which one has to ask. Even more fundamental question in terms of urban public transport, whose responsibility is it? Is it the private people have to look after themselves? Is it central government, state, or local? As per the constitution, it is a state responsibility which has been passed on under 74th constitutional amendment to local bodies. Are our local bodies taking responsibility for public transport is the big question. And if they don't take responsibility, then it will always remain as something which is there and not there. I think that's the key there. How do you bring in local government to take a lead role in building public transport in cities? I think that's one question which I would like to put up here as part of the reform agenda. The second one, if local government, because they own roads, then they manage systems, everything else, and therefore they should be taking up the responsibility. And therefore they should also be managing public transport, whether they run it, they manage it, or they create a company, they create a parastatal. I think that's a subsequent matter which can happen there. The third question which I am posing, I think OP, you in your opening remarks or the first session did ask this question: should fare box be adequate? Will fare box be adequate to recover capital and operating costs? If not, who should fill the gap and who should pay for PT? I think these are series of questions which come up. I think no city in the world recovers full costs, both capital and operating, through fare box collections. And it's well known that PT benefits accrue to entities other than users. Therefore, we need to look at user pay principle as well as beneficiary and polluter pay principle. How do we apply that? I think I'll come to at a later point in the presentation. Now, as I said, we did have JNNURM, we have FAME 1 and FAME 2. All of them, they all funded buses. I think that's where the problem is. How do we, it's not just a capital investment problem. It is more operation problem. I think there was somebody asked the question in the previous session. It is operating capital is operating expenses is much more than the capital cost itself. It's almost like 1:5. I think that's the ratio, which are 1:6 in terms of operating costs and a lifetime operating cost. and the capital cost. And if that is the way it is, and therefore we need to convert capital expenditure into operational expenditure, and that can be done through PPP business there. And then, therefore, PPP, when you come to PPP, I think Prasanna said a very interesting stuff there. In the net cost, we don't collect money, and the gross cost, we don't get money. I think how do we overcome this syndrome is the question we need to be answering, and we need to create a framework. If you look at the history in the past 10, 15 years, there are a lot of net cost contracts which came up in the initial period, but then most of them did not really sustain, and most of them got shut down, and few of them are still operational at a very sustenance level. What is emerging is a gross cost contract. I think that how do we facilitate public-private partnerships through gross cost contracts? I think what kind of contracting mechanism is something which we need to be developing as a framework. Does city governments have a management capacity? We created SPVs as part of the JNNERM, and many of them, they don't even exist. Some of them are there, but then how well do they function is a question. AMTA, we wanted to create. I think these two, SPVs and AMTA, how do you make them functional, and create and make them functional is something which we need to think about, because when you talk about multiple modes, if you do not have AMTA, which will do financing and regulatory and overseeing function, I think then all the disjointed development which have been happening will continue to happen. Then does the private sector have required management capacity? Will they be able to operate? Will they be able to finance? I think over the past 15 years, post especially JNNERM and subsequently Ahmedabad, Delhi, Pune, and many of these cities, Prasanna is one of those pioneering private-public transport operated by private operator, his company. And there are many more now coming up. But then with introduction of the electric buses, now things again have got complicated. Now OEMs have come in as part of the whole game. OEMs, private operators are there, but then third party, which is an energy provider. And then we also get a lot of demand from the bidders that we need to have financier as part of the consortium. Therefore, how many people in the consortium, how do you manage that is a big question which cities will have as part of the contracting mechanisms. I think one of the big things which has been raised by almost all participant speakers is about PPP contracts. Are they balanced? Are they enforced? And many of them contracts are very well written, but then they don't get enforced. I think that's the problem which one would like to highlight. Just in case now, with COVID, a lot of contracts have been force majeure clause has been invoked, leading to a trust gap. And if you don't, there is no level playing field. There is no what you call adhering to the contracts. Then the trust gap, and if that trust gap continues, then the development of the sector is always at risk. Then there are labor issues in the public transport, especially with Uber, Ola, and many of these private entrepreneurial opportunities came up. People do not want to drive buses. It's quite a tedious and straining task. Also because our buses do not have automatic systems and things of that kind. Therefore, how do you make our buses which are more comfortable to drive? That's number one. And then the drivers and their salaries is a major issue in the transport industry, and most drivers would like to minimum work for 1.5 shifts, and then preferably work for 2 shifts. And if we don't allow them to work for 2 shifts, they will go out and work somewhere else. And therefore, this balancing work and rest and then the safety, that business is something, and the payments and the wage bills is a critical issue. How do we address the labor laws is something which we need to look at. Taxes, there is an anomaly. If you buy a fully built bus, you pay 28% GST, and if you buy a chassis and build a bus, and then you pay 18 and 28% of GST. I think that's, and there is an incentive to people go for not standard buses. And that's something which we need to look at. Also, when the private player procures and operates and maintains buses, it will be considered as vehicle on hire. Whereas if the public sector wants, which is the case in many of the bus funding schemes, you fund buses and then make sure that the local authority owns those buses. The moment you become an owner, then you get a private operator operate, then you have the GST levied on that operations, and therefore your operating costs will only increase by that much more. That's an important change which we will have to think about, and also against the proposition that bus funding schemes. And when it came to electric, of course, one I said you need financer, you need energy provider, you need an operator, you need an OEM. I think all of these, and then also disposal of batteries is another important issue which is coming up as part of this. Electricity consumption, who should pay for it? Whether it should be paid by the authority or the operator, and then city authorities, whether we have adequate trunk infrastructure. Then some of that, and then more importantly, creating electric infrastructure is an expensive affair. I think that's something which Government of India should think of funding. Electrification per se in terms of public transport or the overall transport, what is the pace at which you would like to implement? I think some may be taking initiative, moving forward, others maybe wait for everything else to get settled and implement at a later date. I think each city will try and base it on its own, but they need to have a strategy as to how we move forward in terms of the public transport development overall, and then specifically overall transport, and then the public and the private transport thing. That's something which they will have to work through. CMPs which are today prepared, often they are mobility plans. They only look at roads and some broad land allocations, but then do not get into public transport development in a systematic way. Along with CMP, a strategic plan for implementation of bus transport systems at a local level may have to be included, and also the operations plan and management plans. I think those are things which are very rarely done, and sometimes what we see is that city buses and their routes, everything else, once structured, they continue to operate the same way, and therefore they want to take people where they would like to go, but people would like to go to places where there are employment opportunities, where there are business opportunities, and therefore they ultimately are forced to use other modes other than public transport. And that's the gap between public transport not adjusting to the demand, I think is a problem in most Indian cities. I think we need to change this perspective. They need to get onto operations plan and revisions in a periodic manner. Then COVID, most state as well as the city governments have come out with a force majeure clause invocation. And as a result, wherever PPP existed, the drivers have gone back to their villages. Buses are there, and then the drivers are expected to be paid. Operators are not likely to pay, and therefore restarting public transport post-COVID, whether it's 1 month later, 2 months later, is not just a restarting, it is like re-establishing public transport. I think that's the way it is going to be. How we deal with it and how do we ensure safety, hygiene, and then the health conditions of the driver and the staff, all of that is going to be a major concern. I think we need to build in that. An opportunity because of COVID is that our public transport service quality and the standards thereof, whether it is occupancy levels, the loading standards, the cleaning standards, everything is far from satisfactory, and maybe COVID will enable us to look at some of those things and improve them sooner than later. Then cost implications of COVID are very clear. Basically, there are outgoings to the tune of about 1/3 of cost, even if you don't operate, you have to spend because of the fixed variable cost and the fixed cost you will have to anyway bear. As a result of which, that is going to be a loss for the operator for time to come. Whereas if they don't get paid, that becomes a big loss. And then as and when you start public transport, your capacity will be reduced and then your cost will increase. Therefore, how we manage this is an important question. Who will pay for this interim period, and in the post-COVID, till the time you recover back your overall ridership levels, is a question which in some way needs to be addressed sooner than later. And one important innovation which I think is working very well, and the country national as well as other states need to look at, is Gujarat's CM bus scheme. I'm also very happy to state that WRI was instrumental in working in developing this particular scheme. And as per the scheme, they provides a viability gap on operations, and for each bus kilometer, up to 50% of the per kilometer rate, or 12 rupees 50 paisa per kilometer, is given to the local authority as a viability gap, whichever is lower. In case of electric buses, the amount has been, sorry about this convention, it's not conventional, it's electric buses. It's 25 rupees per kilometer is what is given out as a viability gap. With these viability gaps being operational, in Ahmedabad, the gap municipal corporation has to fill in a diesel bus is about 8 rupees. In electric bus, which did not receive central funding, is about 24 rupees. And then in the electric bus, which they received the central support, is only about 4 rupees. I think that's the kind of ultimate gap which the municipal corporation bears. Therefore, this is an interesting scheme. If you really want to promote cities to develop public transport, a viability gap scheme at the city level is necessary. In terms of the way forward, I believe central government should be supporting building public transport infrastructure and promoting sustainable transport innovations. It could be BRT, it could be microsystems, electric buses. I think the new things which needs to come up, I think that's what they need to focus rather than funding buses. Number two, a viability gap model should be encouraged to be instituted by the states, and the government of India should promote this as a kind of a condition for supporting public transport infrastructure development in the cities. TOD, value capture, we keep on talking about TOD and value capture, but then you have to create value before thinking of capturing, and value gets created only after the projects start opening and they start delivering quality services. And therefore, there is a time lag, and that time lag, we can't use it today. I think that is something which one has to be keeping in mind. Believe cities and the transport agencies should have a non-fare bags revenue source which is large enough and which is perennial and which is dedicated for public transport operations funding. And I think that has to come through property tax. As part of the property tax, like water tax, you need to introduce a transport tax, and that becomes a dedicated fund for public transport agencies. One must also remember that today gap is provided by the state governments or the local government, but it is given as a gap. As Prasanna said, you don't let them die, but you don't make them survive and grow. And rather than keeping them in that kind of a situation, you create a property tax based transport tax fund, and that fund is with them, and they need to manage quality public transport, and you dictate them in terms of what is expected out of them in terms of service quantity and quality. local level autonomous institutions with dedicated financial power and freedom to operate and fix fare is what the public transport agencies need to have. PPP for operations is an important thing to look at. One also is not saying where public sector is working well, like in Bangalore. You don't have to dismantle them and you don't have to reinvent the wheel and start PPP. And then support that part of it. Where you don't have public transport, I think PPP is probably the way forward. I think that's where we need to look at. We need to take advantage of technology innovations. Finally, develop institutions and financing systems which can sustain public transport operations. I think that's what should be the key part of it there. I would like to end by saying buses, more buses, better buses, big buses, small buses, mini buses, micro buses. I think it has to be buses if we really have to have sustainable mobility in our cities. Thank you, sir. I think I'll end there.
Thanks, Shivanand. I think very, very interesting points. I will just mention the very starting thing that you mentioned, of whose baby is it? I mean, that is a debate that has been going on for quite some time. Is it the local government baby? Is it the state government baby? Is it the central government's baby? Over time, it seems to have emerged that the central government has to play a very important role. But these questions came up even when the national urban transport policy was being discussed. Why should it be a national policy? Why not a state? Why not a local? But this is a very interesting point. And of course, over time, the national government has emerged as a key player. I think your second last slide, where you laid down 9 different things as part of the way forward, each one of them, I think is extremely important, needs a lot of thought, a lot of detailing, all of them need to be operationalized, but how? I think that's going to be the big question. Let me now move to Prasanna quickly. We are running out of time, and Dario is also online. I would like to give him some time, but after Prasanna.
Thank you, sir. So after Kohli and Dhoni and all good batsmen I have come, so I am coming as a night batsman. So
you're the Kapil Dev. You're the Kapil Dev.
I'll be very quick. So one of the important things which you remember when we discussed about almost 8-10 years back, that we have good policies, but we do not have any legislation which backs those policies. So unless we have legislation which backs those policies, that policy remains only on paper and nothing happens with those policies. So one thing, a starting point could be to work in whatever capacity every one of us has to ensure that this providing of service becomes a mandatory for any city operations rather than optional. So this is the first starting point I would like to say. Second point I would like to say, which Gerald mentioned, many of us are very vehicle focused. So we need to shift our focus from vehicles to customer, and actually while planning, understand customer needs better and accordingly plan our services. So traditionally STUs have been more focused on, because their probably incentive structure to managers is such that if you utilize your assets more, you are rewarded. But if you carry more number of people, there is no meaning to it. So second, my point is, one is institutional structure, which has to be through legislation. Second is when we talk about institution, it becomes very important to have capacity of the people to manage that institution. One of the things which is lacking is even IAS and IPS officers, they unfortunately do not give that much of importance to public transport, because as that also we discussed long back, that there has to be a syllabus in their basic training institution to tell them what is the importance of public transport. It is like catch them young, because when they are learning their first lesson, if this lesson is given, then that would certainly help. So there also we need to work on getting that into their syllabus. So these are the two things about institutions which I would like to say. When it comes to finance, Ravi has very well put it up. Then when you have limited resources with government, how do you utilize those resources to optimum level is what is important. You should not waste that money in buying buses, when buying buses, finances are available with the banks. So you are putting your valuable equity into buying those buses. So rather than use that equity and leverage that equity to maximum to ensure that this system survives for whatever number of years you want it to survive. So that is my second point. Third point, I would like to say that in financing, there are two ways to finance. One finance is which is obligatory. So like some of the routes or some of the areas, you will have to keep on managing them because it's an obligation to run minimum kind of services. But finances should be given, apart from that, finances should be given on the basis of how many people those cities are carrying per penny spent. So if you are spending X amount of money, so if you are carrying, say, with 100 rupees, if you are carrying 100 people, other cities carrying 150 people in 100 rupees, those two cities should be treated differently. And when I'm saying this, I'm keeping that obligatory services outside the purview of this efficiency-based financing. So that is the second thing which I would like to state on. At the same time, when you enter into public-private partnership concession agreements, that concession agreement is drafted in such a fashion that it is bankable. Today, not many concession agreements are bankable, and that is why you don't get that kind of money from the banks, or there is no investor who is willing to put in equity. And if there are investors and if there are this kind of concession agreements, getting finance will not be a problem at all for public transport. I am giving this with very responsible statement after working this field for last 35 years. So believe me, getting funding to buy buses or run buses is easy, but getting viability gap funding is chances of getting you cash credit or whatever is zero. So that money what government has should be utilized very judiciously and for the purpose of ensuring that system survives. Then I will come to my next point, which is brand building and marketing, which is very weak in many of the cities, and it has not been looked upon as an essential thing to do. One of the things why private operators are more successful than public operators is because they look after their branding well, and public operators are not very much conscious about their brand, barring few. So branding and marketing is also very, very important. And last, I would like to say that there has to be a dispute resolution mechanism which is much, much faster than what it is today. My arbitration is going on for last 2 years, whereas our concession agreement says that it has to be over in a month. So under this condition, how we expect good operators to come into this system? So I am also surviving because it is more of my passion than business. But otherwise, getting good operators attracted to public-private partnership is becoming really very, very difficult. And within this COVID period, Mr. Swami has very well elaborated what needs to be done. But one very, very important thing is your carrying capacity, which you utilize to 150 or 200%, is going to come down to less than 50%. That means your revenues are going to come down to almost 15 to 20% of the revenues which you are getting. And now, on top of that, you have additional cost to ensure safety of the people. So how these companies are going to manage? Unfortunately, till yesterday's speech, today's speech, I did not hear, but there is nothing for public transport which is coming from government. So we must lobby to ensure that public transport system survives and it at least sails through this COVID. If we do not do that, during this COVID period, we will find a lot of private operators shutting down their operations. Public-private partnership, as Mr. Shivanand and Dr. Swami said, that it is going to be very difficult to restart these things because if you do not pay your drivers, getting those drivers back is almost next to impossible. So this force majeure clause or whatever, I mean, it is a partnership. So both of us should sit together and ensure that we sail through this and government supports this to sail through this particular COVID period. There was one question which I would like to answer. Somebody had asked one question that can we have penalties for non-adherent to schedule? So here I would like to say for all the attendees that there are enough penalties, but there are less incentives. So when we say penalties, at the same time, we need to think of incentivizing also. So penalties, you think of the thing and that penalty is available in majority of the contracts. So this penalty, what you are referring to, is very small penalty, which is inevitably in all the contracts. But apart from that, there are several penalties. But incentive scheme also, incentive structure also, we need to put up when we draft concession agreements. So on this note, I really thank you, WRI, for giving me this opportunity. And thank you, OP sir, for your guidance. And also, Swami sir, for your knowledge. I have learned a lot of things from you. And Gerald for providing support to public transport. And Ravi for your continued passion for electric buses. Thank you.
Thanks, Prasanna. I must admit that if it wasn't for people like you, I don't think we would have been talking about private operation of public bus services. I mean, we all know the kind of difficulties you went through, and yet you continued with it. I think that is where we still have hope that private operation of bus services will still work. That's why really laud your efforts despite all the problems. As you said,
we'll sail through this.
As you said, it's a passion, not a business for you. I think that's the right way of putting it. A lot of very interesting points that you have made. I really, just one thing that I would like to add on to what you said, this thing about penalties for non-adherence to schedules. You said that there should be incentives also. I would go a little further and say there should be penalties on both sides. What if the other side doesn't make timely payments? You know, how do bus services continue to operate if timely payments are not made? Where is the penalty for delayed payments to an operator? So I think, you know, this is where it's very important to recognize that these kind of things, you know, PPP is a partnership. It's not a client versus service provider. It's a partnership. Both the partners have a stake in making sure that the services are available. They have to work like partners, not on purely a transactional kind of contract. That should be the mindset. So with that, let me thanks a lot, Prasanna. I think that was very interesting hearing you, as it is all the time. Now Dario has also joined us. Dario is who we considered our global guru on urban transport in WRI. Dario has with great difficulty joined us. He was having some technical problems. Most of us here know Dario. There was a time when I was in Washington and Dario used to be in India more often than I was, and I often used to feel that you've taken over in my country. But Dario, let's hear from Dario some of the global experiences in these kinds of national support to public transport programs. Dario, over to you.
Thank you very much, Opi. I hope the sound is okay. Can you?
It's okay.
Great. I really appreciate this opportunity to be in the 16 bus Karo. I was in the first one and in several others, and I really appreciate the opportunity to exchange knowledge. I also learned a lot from different participants in India and all the dialogue that the WRI has created over the years. And one of the areas that we have discussed a lot in previous bus Karos, and we are discussing today in a different environment given the pandemic, is this issue of national finance. Normally, public transportation is given to states and to local governments, to cities, as something they need to solve on their own. And cities and states try to do it the best way possible. But they have found a lot of barriers and a lot of difficulties because of this responsibility of providing public transportation is not is always a service. It's a service, a public service. Is in the way it has been envisioned, it looks like it needs to be operated like a business. And probably this is the most important element in policy looking forward for countries like India and many other developing nations and that are really emerging with urban growth very rapidly, is that public transportation doesn't need to be seen as a business in itself. It needs to be seen as a service. It can be privately provided, but several of the cost of the service and the opportunity to provide it with quality require support. Swami, which I also have been learning a lot from him, uh, talk about the viability gap. The viability gap is something that is critical in making the systems to operate with quality. And probably that's the most important national policy that needs to be in place. It is the recognition that public transportation is a service that the cities need to achieve also national goals, and that is impossible to fund public transportation only out of the user fare. That recognition is common in national programs in the European Union, in the US, in Canada, in Australia, in Japan, and it's growingly being recognized by other countries. And that's the reason countries like Brazil, countries like Mexico created national programs. It was not possible for the cities and the states on their own to meet the public transportation needs in the cities. So the national government started providing grants and funding for three purposes. The first purpose is providing guidance, providing policy guidance. The second purpose is provided funding in two forms. The funding for capital projects, co-funding the infrastructure, and in some occasions the vehicles, and also funding in the form of providing the cities and the states the opportunity to raise revenue for public transportation in the form of demand management measures like parking or congestion charge or the value capture. This needs national regulation so the cities and the states are able to raise that funding. And the third activity, which is of utmost importance, is capacity building. It's providing the cities the opportunity, the cities and the states, the opportunity to create the right institutions to manage and deliver public transportation. One program that I'm very familiar with is the national program in Colombia, the country. I'm talking from the city of Bogota in Colombia, which is a medium-sized city for Indian standards. We live 8 million people in the capital of Colombia, and some of the cities in India are this size. Uh, uh, and there was no national policy to provide for public transportation 20 years back. It was cities on their own trying to find a way, and there was one restriction in the national policy in Colombia, and it was that it was necessary that the user fare was required to pay for all the expenses apart from infrastructure. So pay the full bus, pay the operation of the bus, the driver, the maintenance, all the things only out of the user fare. With the introduction of a Transmilenio BRT system in the city of Bogota 20 years back, it was possible to do it because the system was very efficient. In the first corridors, it was possible to cover the buses and the operations of the buses just out of the user fare, and it was it was possible to do it under a PPP scheme, which was very successful at the beginning. But as the system kept growing and going to other places and not necessarily having the infrastructure that was done in the first corridors, that condition didn't happen again. And then the city needed to have this viability gap. And it was not only the case of Bogota, but other cities in the country that were supported by the national government. So the biggest change in national policy only happened 4 years ago when the national government uh, eliminated that restriction of full fare box recovery ratio. And and that was an important step towards making the systems really work. Now, the national government is not providing funding for this viability gap, but it is providing instruments so the cities are able to raise revenue on their own and cover this gap. This was a very important change in policy. And very recently, just this year, in April 14, the national government of Colombia released a new national policy. This new national policy, it's very interesting that it was released in the middle of of COVID-19 because it is providing the future a roadmap for mobility, not just public transportation in cities in Colombia. And the principles of this new national policy is about moving people, not necessarily moving cars. It provides multiple instruments for the cities to continue working on improving walking, bicycling, public transportation, and it also includes provisions for national government to support the capital cost of rolling stock for rail systems and buses in the case of the cities that work with continue working with buses. So I think it's a very important evolution over 20 years from no funding for operations to funding at least of the capital cost of the vehicles and instruments for the cities to cover the viability gap. Now, with these policies, the national government of Colombia, which is very similar to other countries here in Latin America, are ready to uh, go after the COVID crisis goes over. And the main reason is that the policy is, even though we're now talking about physical distances of people, what the national policy in Colombia is talking that instead of promoting more car use and individual vehicle use like motorcycles, two-wheelers, the national policy in Colombia is aiming at a sustainable development of the public of the transportation systems. It is going to be difficult because there will be a lot of pressure to continue using cars and motorcycles, to continue growing the use of cars and motorcycles because of the fear of the virus. But the national policy in Colombia, it's aiming at sustainable mobility using the same principles that WRI and others have been promoting over the years. Avoid the need of extensive travel, shift to the most sustainable modes, and improve the technology. And to finish this short talk, I just mentioned that there is an important advance in electromobility in the public transportation sector in Colombia. And cities are moving really fast to include electric vehicles in their bus fleets. The city of Bogota just last year completed the acquisition of 400 plus buses. The city of Medellin has 64 already in operation. The city of Cali has 25. And the national government is very interested in continue the growth and has very ambitious goals on electrification of bus fleets. And that electrification of bus fleets will require this national supporting funding. Those are my remarks. I am ready for questions that you may have. I really appreciate this opportunity to travel to India without the 24-hour trip, just by connecting through this instrument of the webinar, and really appreciate the opportunity to contribute to Bus Karo 16.
Thanks a lot, Dario. I think in the interest of time, we will take question after the last session because the speaker for the sessions are already here. So I would request you all to, if it's possible, to stay, and then we'll take question in the end. So let's quickly move on to the last session, which is looking at how does public transport respond to COVID-19? And we have seen that the ridership on the systems have gone down, and Gerald quoted a figure that bus operations India is going to lose almost 1.5 lakh crore in 2020 due to no and low ridership, and that's humongous amount of money that is lost. And so as cities try to open up the system and move from the lockdown to the recovery phase, what do they do, what they should be doing, and how do they go about kind of bringing faith back into public transport? So we have 5 eminent speakers. Mr. Jasmine Shah from Delhi government, to the chairperson of Development and Dialogue Commission. Mr. Ramamurthy, who has been with us since beginning from KSRTC. Mr. Yugandhar from TSRTC, he is there with us. Thank you for joining. Rupa Nandi, a dear friend from UIDP, she is with us. And Rushabh Shah from CityFlow is here to give the private sector perspective. So let me first start by asking one is that as we move from the lockdown phase to an opening up phase, how are we preparing to start the bus service? And maybe I'll start first by asking Jasmine, and then Mr. Yugandhar and Mr. Ramamurthy can pitch in. What's the thinking about opening up bus transport in respective cities?
Thank you, Amit, and thank you to WRI for having me on this online event. Amit, the questions that you raised are exactly the one that, at least in Delhi, we are grappling with quite considerably over the last few weeks, as we've started thinking that after an extended period of lockdown, what next, and how do we really get the public transport up and running? There are 3 major challenges that the Delhi government is right now trying to tackle as we answer this question, because I think if we figure the answer to these challenges, then the strategy will automatically emerge. First is the safety question, right? What are the measures that we need to take, obviously for ensuring commuter safety, but also for the large number of staff, because we have seen the examples of cities globally, especially New York, where after the healthcare workers, it is the public transport workers who have actually borne the maximum brunt of corona spread. So what are the various measures? How do we educate them? What kind of safety equipment do we provide? What does it mean in terms of their staffing pattern? So there are a lot of those questions that we are trying to answer. The second big challenge is, how do you instill confidence amongst the commuters, right? And that is where I think the communication also will need to be thought of very carefully, because let's ask frankly, all of us, that if given an option of using our own personal vehicle versus traveling by public transport at this current moment, what would we prefer? So there's an obvious risk that everybody perceives, saying should we really use public transport? And therefore, especially the middle class, my sense is many of them would want to opt out, unless and until we invest and we carefully think about confidence building measures, very clear communication that the government is actually taking a number of steps to ensure that they stay protected while using public transport. The third challenge is going to be revenues, because in general we are seeing declining riderships in many cities in India, but especially with the fear of corona, and second, the fact that you will need to ensure safe distancing. So as it is, your carrying capacity is going to come down to maybe a third of what you do have in normal times. So what does that mean in terms of revenues? And is it going to mean that cities will now not invest heavily in upgrading public transport? I'm certain, at least in Delhi, we are not going down that path, but there is obviously going to be a fiscal shock in terms of the public transport system. And given that there is an overall economic shock that our cities and states are facing, the ability of the state to then meet a high degree of viability gap is also a serious question. So these are, I think, the gamut of things that as Delhi government we are trying to address. There is already a plan that the Delhi Metro has been working on, but also the buses, the DTC and TIMS, which is running the private concessionaires in Delhi, they have worked out, which is looking at all stages of operating the public transport. But I must say that given the way the current decision making is happening in the country, first and foremost, the center will need to spell out whether at what stage would they be comfortable to let cities operate public transport, because so far all the cities have been assigned as red zones with no public transport. But we also expect the cities to slowly start coming back to normalcy and some level of economic activity to begin. But we know that most of the people, economy is not going to start unless your public transport at least starts functioning at a basic level of service. So, but provided the center does allow states to have a higher say, I'm pretty confident that in Delhi we are prepared to at least start a basic level of service, starting with some of the most trunk routes to begin with, but also ensuring that all the protective steps and measures are in place.
Thanks a lot, Jasmine. And it's great to see that you reinforce the fact that Delhi at least will concentrate on buses, and then you are looking at operating it once we get a kind of green signal from the center. Let me come to Mr. Yugandhar. Sir, if you can also share some perspective of TSRTC and what is the current thinking around opening up the bus service. Yes, sir. Please go ahead. I guess there is some connectivity issue. So maybe then I'll come to Mr. Ramamurthy, and maybe we can hear you about the KSRT's perspective of opening up the service.
Yeah, that's now it's a great challenge for the STU, which has never experienced this kind of an situation. We are all pretty getting equipped ourselves by sanitizing the buses. We have started doing this just before the lockdown also, which is another big burden for us. Rather, I mean to say that rather, in addition to the regular maintenance that we are doing, we have started sanitizing. We have used more than extensively 25% to 30% of our mechanics and additional work, other workers also for getting all this sanitized. One challenge is that now the new thing is we have to scan, and then thermal scanning has to happen. The social distancing has to be maintained. This needs a lot of efforts and also some investments towards buying all these equipments also. For example, in an airport, they have a thermal scanning, which is quite expensive, maybe costing about 4 to 5 lakhs. And then we have also checked that there are technology available, maybe in China also, there is some ultraviolet cleaning facilities are there. Even in a bus, we can have a thermal scanning being done. Some 2-3 seconds, it will be able to rather scan a person, and then it will make whether a temperature is having or not. But that needs an investment of about a lakh of rupee and all. So without much expenditure also with this crisis, we have to manage. And then we have to facilitate all our drivers. We have to be very careful about our drivers' safety also. Otherwise, this will become like if some, luckily, in spite of operating about 1 lakh passengers, we have migrants, we have shifted from Bangalore city to the other parts of the state. And then we operated about 3,000 trips. Luckily, by God's grace, none of our drivers have been infected. So far, we have been watching them, and then we are taking care of their family also to watch them carefully. This is a new type of a challenge, and then we need to have another major problem will be once the social, this cannot be done simultaneously. See, the Bangalore also metro will not, metro is taking care of the city's requirements of the transport in the peak hours to a very great extent on the main lines. Now, if the metro is also coming out, I think their carrying out carry capacity will come down by at least 10% if they strictly follow the social distancing. So then the challenge of the city buses is that with maintenance of the social distance and then carrying out only 50% of the capacity, how do we manage at the peak hours? So the staggering of the timings of different institutions should take place immediately with a government strictly bringing down some policy. Otherwise, all being at a time, definitely, and our capacity will be 50% with the existing buses. So then we cannot pump in another 50% extra facilities or the numbers of buses at a time. I think some serious policy decision has to be taken, because we are all told, and then we came with the scientific studies and all, this will be there for another 4 or 5 months to go, or at least 6 months to go. And then considering the seriousness of the infections and other things, maybe social distancing cannot go just like that for next 2-3 months, and then the economic activity also to be carried out. I think some decision has to be taken in staggering the time. That is one of the most important and also an easiest solution with the existing one. And then the shortfall of revenue already all discussed, and then we have to take care of all this. And then the contactless ticketing system, all these things have to happen, which we were trying to do for several years. Automated ticketing systems, cashless transactions and all. Now we cannot expect everything to happen within 1 or 2 months. This is a big challenge, but from our side, we are getting ourselves prepared to handle the public, like the sanitization and then fumigation also we are trying to do. What all the possibilities, things that are available, and then the scientific advisors, they advise, we are trying to make it happen. We are anyway maybe the lockdown situation may be somewhat to extend, it may be released by 30th of this May, then maybe at least by June first week, I think we are able to operate most of the services in green zones, and slowly start operating the interstate services also with proper care being taken towards the sanitization and other things.
So let me just quickly come to Mr. Uganda. Sir, if you can hear me.
Thank you very much. I agree with Mr. Jasmine Shah as well as Ramurthy Karu. And in Hyderabad, right from the 5th day of this lockdown period, we have been running emergency services for the medical teams as well as municipal staff. And also we have been transporting goods like milk and also this Balwadi, Anganwadi food materials to various places. So as Mr. Ramurthy Garu has said, we have been taking a lot of measures to educate our workers, our drivers and conductors first regarding these COVID measures. And also we are sanitizing buses, supplying masks as well as sanitizers to them. As of there are no cases in our organization, and we are happy, and we are not contented with it. We are going to take some more measures. We are waiting for the orders from the government, and as and when they are issued, then we will be following the social distance norms in bus stops as well as bus terminals. We are trying to procure some these temperature measuring instruments, and with the help of medical teams, we may deploy in bus terminals. This is our preliminary plan of action.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Uganda. Let me just come to Rishabh Shah, who is involved with City Flow. Rishabh, can you also share some insight on what, as a private sector operator, you are thinking to address some of these fears surrounding the COVID-19 and transit use?
Yeah, absolutely, Amit. I think one of the biggest challenges that we see as a private operator in the commute service is that we need to rebuild the confidence of passengers, ensure that they do not sort of move away from shared mobility into back into private modes. So that's going to be extremely important. So every measure that we've taken is focused on ensuring safety as well as rebuilding confidence. In terms of what we're thinking of, the measures that we've put in place, I just want to highlight, in addition to what everyone else has mentioned, we've looked at it from 3 aspects. The most important aspect is ensuring protection for our drivers. So we've given them personal protective equipment, masks, sanitizers. But also what we've gone ahead and done is that for all our drivers, we've looked at COVID-19 insurance. So we have cover from insurance agencies that will protect the drivers in the uh, you know rare situation in case one of them gets infected. We are obviously disinfecting the buses with hospital grade disinfectant twice a day. This is already happening because we are providing buses to essential service providers, and this will continue as we expand our operations into regular operations, because we do believe that this is something that we have to now live with. This is a new reality. So that is also something that we're focusing on. Customers and commuters will be asked to carry masks mandatorily. Social distancing norms of 50% capacity will be enforced. And also the drivers have been provided with temperature guns to check temperatures of the passengers before they're boarding. And the ground team will ensure that drivers' temperatures are also measured. And the third aspect that we're really focusing on is using technology to help us fight this, which includes what some of the things that we're doing around this is ensuring, for example, when we plan our routing, we ensure that we do not have pickup or drop points in demarcated zones or quarantine zones. We have self-declaration. We are using the Arogya Setu app both for our drivers as well as our customers, ensuring self-declaration is taking place before onboarding of the service. And in the situation, we have SOPs in place to prepare that in a situation that there is an infection on the bus, we use contact tracing to ensure that we inform all the relevant authorities as well as all the passengers to be aware of this. So I think that's going to be a very important aspect going forward, that how can we use technology to leverage public safety in a shared mobility option. And that is something that we're rapidly evolving towards. One, we are already 100% cashless, so some of those aspects are solved for. But these are other aspects that we're now incorporating in our systems and our services to ensure that we have as much public safety in place as possible.
Thanks a lot, Rishabh. So on this point, when you mentioned some SOPs that you are following, so let me just bring Rupa Nandi from UITP. Rupa, can you share some insights around standard operating procedures for safe transit operation that has been done globally by UITP?
Sure. Thank you, Amit. I will just share my screen and I will share some of the data as well that's there with us, because we at UITP are constantly across the world, trying to gather data that what's happening. And just a second. Yeah. So basically, first thing to TSRTC, to KSRTC, to Jasmine, do not worry. Everywhere people are worried, but nowhere we are in a condition where the complete services have been stopped. 4th May onwards, Europe is opening up, other countries are opening up. So this is the as-is situation. These are the countries which I've listed. Basically, I look for countries which are in a worse situation than India. You guys can see my screen, I suppose.
Yes, we can see your screen, absolutely.
Yeah. So the first column is the services that are being offered in terms of frequency, in terms of scheduling. However, if you look at the rightmost column, that is the actual ridership drop, not the ridership drop that all the countries are facing. So this is very specific to bus that I have collected. I have not included metros as such in this. And other than China, which is at the 10th number, if you see, most of the rest of the world is suffering very badly. But that has still not stopped them from providing a service. So the service is still in place. Now coming to the situation that what measures globally all these operators are taking. So measures can be largely divided into two parts, for the staff and for the passenger. So for the staff, it is gloves, masks, sanitizing products, regular cleaning, and not just the vehicles, it is the workshops, it is their own offices, it is the maintenance areas. If it is a gas station, even that. If it is a charging station, then even that. They are trying to make disinfectant dispensers available to the staff and the passengers in the vehicles as well. So that even as a passenger, when you get in, you have the assurance, okay, I didn't carry my sanitizer, but I can always use the one in bus. They are trying to limit the staff and passenger interactions. So it could be by simply dividing your driver area with something really simple as a plastic sheet to go forward with. And obviously for staff, they are doing regular temperature checks. For passengers, they are marking seats. Like in Hong Kong, what they have done is gone for alternately marking seats. In China, South Korea, Singapore, a lot of other European countries such as Germany, Luxembourg, what they are doing, they have made masks mandatory in public transport, without which they are not letting passengers get on board. Contactless payments everywhere, and basically coming to where it all started, Wuhan, they have started separating healthy versus infected people. And if we see how they are doing it through a QR code. So every citizen has been kind of marked with a QR code. You can only get into a station, you can only onboard a metro or a bus if you are marked as green. So I know in India it will be a big challenge to kind of implement this. I mean, not every citizen can be marked with a QR code. Again, for operator, they have personal protection kits, they have disinfection. For AC-based vehicles, very strong ventilation. They're ensuring the air gets circulated at a regular level. But again, even in Wuhan, the authority has mandated that you have to run at least 40% at the transport capacity. They are not saying that just because of COVID go away. So as Jasmine had rightly pointed out, as Mr. Ramamurthy had rightly pointed out, that restoring trust is the first thing that we have to look for. A very strong communication from the government, from the authorities have to go that, look, we are doing these 10 things to make sure that you travel safe. In terms of, but again, it is not an operator or an authority responsibility. We have now come to a situation we have to treat it as a city. So as a city, we have to look for solutions. We have to look for staggering offices, staggering schools, so that the load is not that much at one point of time. We have to again take care of the public transport workforce, the supply industry. If there's any financial institutional support that we can provide, that is also something that I think as advocacy bodies, we should ask for all the public transport operators and authorities. Way ahead is the new normal. We have to live with it, and in this whole thing, we should not lose the bigger side, the bigger ecological crisis that we all are going through. So this is something that we have to move ahead with. So yeah, that's it from my side.
Thanks a lot, Rupa. I think some valid points and some great insight on how do you move forward. On this point, I wanted to come back to Jasmine. Jasmine, so as you heard, people advocating use for transit, and I think a lot of us are basically transit lovers. So whether you ask us or not, we will anyways advocate transit. But the question which I wanted to ask you was that recently Delhi government had a massive consultation with its citizens of Delhi on what needs to be done. Did the issue of bus feature in any of the feedback that you received from people? Are people asking for a bus, or it's only we as transport planners are suggesting that government should run buses?
No, I think what should be done with transport figured as one of the most popular, areas of feedback. And it's not just transit, but also paratransit, because we do know that, autos, taxis, as well as buses. And I must say, there was a lot of suggestions that people have asked, and largely from the point of view of initiating buses, because we do know that there's a large chunk of our economy that is dependent on buses. And as far as if you think about coming to buses, at least in Delhi, they carry close to twice as many more people as the Delhi Metro. So there have been a lot of suggestions on buses. Of course, I think nobody is asking for a full-fledged opening of buses. Mostly people are coming with their own suggestions as to what should the government do to ensure that safety is foremost, but we also start opening up buses, because with the kind of sprawl that is there in Delhi, it's just almost unimaginable that people will be able to travel. However, one big challenge, on an associated issue that we are facing is also to figure out which routes should we first start with, because maybe some industrial areas or some areas where earlier buses were running, they are seeing low demand, or they are opening up more slowly than the other parts of the city. So I think there will be some kind of an iterative figuring out in terms of which routes to deploy more buses in, and maybe we may even think about, I was happy to hear about the on-demand, routes that have been, put together in some parts of the world. So we will have to figure out that model as well to ensure that we don't run, at the end of the day, we don't want to run empty buses as well.
So one more question, Jasmine. I think this also came from Radha, is that as we move towards technology, whether it is digital payment or use of Arogya Setu app, we are also running the risk of marginalizing some of the poor. So is this what you're also thinking, kind of mandating digital payment will leave a certain population out of the usage of the transit system? How will you then look at balancing some of these things?
Yeah, no, so it is certain that at least in our case, we are not looking at making these mandatory. I'm talking largely of Delhi's buses, because there is an exclusion issue and there is also a legality issue of to what extent can you mandate some of these things. I think the real point here is to be creative and to really figure out other ways in which you're trying to ensure that there is less human touch and contact, but it should not defeat the first purpose of public transport, which is to actually move people.
Thanks a lot, Jasmine. The other question which came from Rima Prajapati, and this also has been under discussion, and maybe Mr. Yugandhar and Ramamurthy sir can update. So there's a section which feels that we should open up first non-AC buses, and there's apprehension of opening up AC buses. So in your perspective, should we also look at opening up, starting AC routes? And if so, what are the safety protocols that we should take, which will be different from a non-air conditioned buses?
I think AC buses also can be operated to make out the shortfall of the buses when we go for a peak service and other things. It can easily be converted into we have got the air ventilators and other things. There is a provision the doors can be opened and then that can be operated. Only thing is the operation of the AC buses is definitely going to be much expensive than the regular buses which are with non-AC buses. So that cost has to be taken care, and then we have to, nobody knows really exactly what is the threat of traveling in AC buses, how much distance or what is the time duration that it will add to a implication of all this and all. It's not been really experienced. So just like that, we have been told to stop this by the health department and others. So that's why we have stopped operating. In fact, recently we have invested a huge money into the AC buses, which were supposed to be catering to the peak season now, which we have lost it now. Already it's May end. But somehow, see that shortfall also can be taken care. But conversion of AC into non-AC, only thing is we cannot permanently change over as far as the infrastructure, I mean to say the structure of the bus is concerned. We can know for a city buses, I think we can easily convert into non-AC and then operate it. That's not an issue. But other things you have even actually for the intercity buses we have the sleeper buses and Rajamsa buses are also there, which can be temporarily used as per the requirement. Even for the city buses, we can use our special buses of Rajamsa buses and other things. But only issue is the cost of operation is the only big question for either a private operator or the government buses, that's like STU. Even for a private operator, for example, we see a lot of how city flow is operating, and then for all the software companies and then the factories, now they will have to look into an economical way. They are also will be looking into an economical way of transporting their own workers also. But now earlier, which we used to carry about double the, I mean to say the regular 100% capacity of 55 will come down to 30, and then the cost of operation again for the transport, they will have to shell out more money. I think the same is the case with the schools also. If they want to start a school from August or with the social distancing in force, I think it's terrible. And then these already lot of cities are congested with the vehicles like maybe cars and two-wheelers. Now it will go double. So all people will start using their personal transports rather than the public transport. I think we have to come out with some kind of a mode or some policy to take care of all this. Otherwise, it will become a havoc-like thing because everybody is afraid of using. Even I came to know that a lot of people, even when the school authorities were asking about, the parents are not prepared to pay the money for the public, their own school transport also. Most of them would like to carry them, drop them to the school by using their personal transport and all. I think in the days to come, in next 2-3 months, I think all departments have to work together, and then the government should take a policy on this, not only considering the cost and also the road usage. I think that's what I feel so.
On this point, I just wanted to ask Dario. Dario, in Bogota, are you operating air-conditioned buses in the COVID times, or you are over there? The operation is mostly non-air-conditioned buses.
Operation in Bogota is mostly non-air-conditioned buses. Bogota, Colombia is a tropical country, but Bogota is a high level. It's very high above the sea level. So air condition is not a requirement in the buses of Bogota. So that's not an issue here. But the issue of separation is a big issue. There's a national instruction of reducing capacity to 35% of the buses. So the city is running all the buses, but only with a peak load of 35% of what they usually carry. And this is a big drop in the revenues, and the city is looking for funding to cover this additional cost that comes with not having the passengers in the system, and it's calling for national support on that.
Thank you, Dario.
Yeah. So Amit, I would like to add a point here. UITP also did a survey regarding HVAC of all LRT, metro, and other bus operators as well, regarding what exactly they are doing for this. So nowhere in the world they have stopped AC. What they have done is they have increased the frequency of cleaning the filters. And globally, the view is that AC is rather circulating the air inside and keeping it fresh than making it, more vulnerable. So they just have set SOPs that you need to clean in this time interval, and they are going on with it. So yeah, that's it.
Yes, sorry to intervene. In fact, even before, much before this COVID, I think last 1 year, what we have done is we are operating the fly buses, as you know, from airport to the different cities for the passengers, benefit the passengers to directly go to, instead of going in taxis, we were operating fly buses, which were very popular. We have started a concept of fumigation. that once in 2 months we use one chemical that's not dangerous to any health of all the health hazard. We have started fumigating the whole bus. We were doing it once in 2 months, and then we took the response from the public also. It was so encouraging. In fact, now in the recent days, just before this COVID, I think from December, January onwards, we started fumigating once in a month also. We have 100% fumigated all our AC buses just before sometime in January also. January, February, we have done that. That is, it results say that we have done that swab testing and other things also. It has from the 600 level of bacteria, and then it has come down to 40, 50, where all the people touch, like the handles and other things. We don't know exactly how does it affect with the virus, but still we went on doing all this, but it all costs. So that's why AC, I don't think AC is totally to be banned, but we have to take cautiously a decision on this. Thank you.
Sure. No, absolutely. And I think the reason I asked was because a lot of cities have an AC fleet, and there was a perception that one should not operate AC because of the safety issues, and that's the reason why we thought let's have some perspective on this topic. So one of the questions which has come, and this is maybe I'll ask Gerald, Professor Swami, and also Dario to answer. And this is a question which is basically from Neha Mittal, and she's asking, what will be the new normal in mobility pattern and use of public transport post-COVID?
Well, I mean, if I knew really the answer, it would be a miracle, because I think we are all trying to think more about scenarios at this point. We don't really know exactly what will happen, and we don't know exactly when the new normal will come either. So I think a lot of people are asking the question of first, will bus traffic come back? And we can think about it in two phases. One is the recovery period that we are going to enter as we leave the lockdown, which will be gradual. Initially, when we look at places like China, the first month was at very, very low traffic, and by now it's growing to the point where we are at 50, 60%, depending on the city. So it takes a few months to recover. Now, one thing to keep in mind, because of what we said earlier, that there was a gross undersupply of buses in India, is that a lot of people don't have a choice, right? So it's likely that as you reopen your service, people will really flock to the service, hoping to have a seat. And one of the challenges you will face is there will not be the capacity within maybe not the first month, but month 2 or 3, to deal with that inflow, and they need to add capacity to that by maybe thinking about bringing in private operators on a temporary basis to supplement your existing fleet. Now, as you go to the new normal, and the new normal may be 6 months, 12 months, we don't really know per se. It will depend on how the second wave, if it happens, take place. But at that point, I think people will need to be confident that the system is safe, but is safe not on an exceptional basis, but as part of the common SOPs that are being applied. And there, provided that you're providing a quality of service that is suitable, and the hygiene protection, etc., you will see traffic coming back. So that's why when we spoke earlier about what needs to happen now and what is your 2030 vision, these are two very different phases. But what is being done on public transport today and over the next 6-12 months is going to define how public transport is going to be seen by the users. So it's a very important pivotal time.
Thanks a lot, Gerard. Professor Swami and Dario.
Waiting for Professor Swami.
Go ahead, Dario. I think there is some issue with Professor Swami.
Okay. Yes, this is we need to run the scenarios, and it's difficult to say what will happen. But and there's this fear that physical distance needs to be kept between people, and that affects public transportation. But we need to recognize that public transportation is the lifeline of during the crisis and beyond. And transit can make urban civilization possible. This is a quote from Jared Walker, Human Transit, who is heavily promoting, and as part of this global movement, that we don't need to go back to normal. We need to go back to better, and public transportation is part of it. So what is needed is to solve this issue of financing public transportation, providing this viability gap, and providing the opportunity for public transportation to be better quality after the crisis, during the crisis, and after the crisis, being high quality public transportation that is attractive, and the people continue riding public transportation, because the alternative is heavy congestion, pollution, traffic accidents, and exclusion that comes from single motorized modes.
Thanks a lot, Dario. Professor Swami, can you hear us? Okay, so maybe we'll move ahead. Last couple of questions. I think one question is on how do agencies plan to limit the number of people who get in the bus?
Amit, I'm back. Huh?
Okay, Prasami, very quickly on your take on life post-COVID, life of mass transit or public transport post-COVID or during COVID.
During COVID, I think it's all about stay home and stay safe, right? But then I wish we had cities operating, even if it is limited, some public transport, taking people to work. I think that's something which has not happened, which will have to happen. But more important thing right now, we need to look at the short, medium, and the long-term perspective. In the short and the medium term, I believe there is a big mobilization support which will be required both in terms of the guidance, finance, and the devices. And in the hello.
Yes,
hello?
we're hearing you, Swami.
Yeah. And in the long term, there is a need to keep the focus on public transport and also quality improvements with whatever restrictions which will have to happen. I believe the strategy will have to be of these three kinds: and financial support, technical support, supply of devices, materials, guidance is going to be very, very critical. And equipping governance system, new governance systems, and the manpower. How do we train and retrain them to manage public transport differently is going to be a key task. And sure, yeah.
Thanks a lot, Professor Swami.
And in the long run, anyway, it will probably bounce back to new normal, which is going to be more than normal, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. I think so. That's what Gerald also mentioned, that the transition phase should not be confused as a new normal. We are entering a transition phase, and then after that, new normal. So one question which is very, very practical and was put was, how will agencies manage restricting number of people who board? So whether it is 33% or 40% occupancy level, how are we going to make sure that only these many people get in the bus? So maybe Mr. Yugandhar, if you can hear me, would you like to take this question? How will you restrict the number of people in the vehicle?
The thing is, in Hyderabad city, we are trying to plan, we are trying to operate only in identified routes. We are planning to cut branch routes. We are also trying in Hyderabad city, the boarding and exit is through both the doors. Therefore, we are trying to restrict the boarding as well as exit. That is, we want to see that the boarding is through the back door and exit is from the front door. That is one-way entry and one-way exit. that we are trying to do. And also we are going to implement ground booking in high frequency routes. Ground booking make that conductor can be eliminated. Therefore, we are trying to make ground booking as much as possible. And also we are interested in we are taking up communication measures so that people can understand. And also we want to see that there is some door at the back door, that is entry, so that people can't enter in between the stages. There is a habit of entering into the bus in between the stages, that we are trying to prevent by this door method. At present, there is no door to the city buses. This is all.
Okay, thanks a lot. So one last question, and maybe I'll ask this to Jasmine. So a lot of time it's been said that usage of mask will improve safety. So is this what Delhi government is also contemplating as a mandatory requirement, that one should cover its face, at least mouth and nose, before entering the bus, whether it is surgical mask or cloth or any other thing?
Yeah, I think two things are, and this is not just about public transport, but I think the larger way of life, I mean, at least how the Delhi government is thinking, that social distancing and masks is mandatory. The moment you step out, I think the big question is how can we really enforce it? And if I think cities will need to really make up their mind that if needed, people will need to be even fined and reprimanded if you're violating any of these two norms, social distancing and wearing masks. So this is something that we are at least very seriously going to follow. We also foresee that whatever decision is announced for the post May 17 lockdown phase, wearing masks will continue to stay mandatory, anytime you step out the home. And I think all the evidence, there's very, very strong evidence in that favor. So we are looking forward to enforcing it very strictly.
Thanks a lot, Jasmine. So with this, let me thank everyone and bring this webinar to a close. We are already overshot by almost 20 minutes. So we had about close to 1,000 registration, and at one time we had 500 attendees. Right now we are about 160 odd people who are still with us, so that's great. I think we had about 190 questions which were asked, and sorry we could not answer all these questions, but we are recording the webinar and we will share the link. But again, thank you everyone for taking your time off, and it's great to see, one, there is some the need for having a national support from buses, and it's no better time than to have that support right now, where we are seeing a huge disruption in terms of the mobility due to the COVID crisis. So again, thank you everyone for joining. We will share the link to this webinar and look forward to some future interaction as well. Thanks again, be safe, and we'll be in touch. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.